Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is The Moon's Tears in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 31, Came. X. Ichigo sat on the edge of the skyscraper, peering at misty depths below and shrouded in ever-rising flood waters that swayed and tossed fervently depending on his emotional state. There were harsh gales billowing throughout his inner world, buffeting the sides of the towering buildings and sending emerald leaves scattering about the air in a way that reminded Ichigo of a certain Disney movie Yuzo loved. The orange-haired Shinigami basked in the sensations, the feeling of the wind ripping through strands of sharp orange, cutting into the flowing Shinigami robes and desperately enticing him with thoughts of falling, the vindictive sensation of it all. Letting his arms hang stretched out comfortably beside him, Ichigo closed his eyes and tipped his head back. He felt almost invincible in the face of the wind. It was an empowering sensation. Freedom was heady, and maybe sometimes the wind whispered it so lustfully in his ear, that he was tempted to fall away. Gingerly rising to unsteady feet, Ichigo swayed a bit, easily flowing with the motions before he considered the murky depths below. With a slight exhale, that was more nerves and bravery than anything else, he stepped off the ledge and fell. The air soared and raged around his form, pulling the material parts of him, all the heaviness of his emotions and the weight of his thoughts up, as gravity dragged his soul below. He crashed into the waves, like one saunters into water, gently with hardly a ripple of motion, sinking deep beneath the waves, embraced as if by large avian wings. Distractedly he watched bubbles float up to the surface, where the bases of the skyscrapers encased sunlight into beaming rays like that of a heavenly being, to shine upon his features. Ichigo could feel them in his inner world, hiding from him, just as he was hiding from them. Avoiding the inevitable confrontation that chased at his heart with fear, and bit at his nerves. The knowledge was sharp like a lance, and seemed to pull the water around him in vicious ways, like coiling hands of deep-sea creatures. Ichigo's left hand curled into a fist even as the other helplessly reached towards the growing distance between the surface and his sinking form. He wanted to move forward from all the pain, and he was near ready. But he couldn't, not till he had reconciled with his Zanpakuto, because they were everything when there was nothing left, and veritably far wiser than him. They were often the ones to finesse his half-baked battle plans. Ichigo didn't want to face the confrontation, the accumulation of the guilt and sorrow, dreading what it might bring. Their despair and pain lingering between and within the three was his own. He was the source tenfold. His body trembled lightly with repressed emotions and the feelings coursing inside him, theirs, his, an endless cycle. Just as seamlessly as they often blended together, thoughts merging till they were one being once more, the soul made whole. Ichigo's thoughts drifted to a halt as his back impacted against a rough surface that dug into his spine yet soothed his racing pulse. Curious, Ichigo turned his head slowly in an exhausted motion to look at what he had fallen onto. The bark of a tree visited his sight, the wide trunk stretching a ways below to join with the blocky base of a skyscraper, where Ichigo could barely make out the curving wreath of roots floating and peeking out from the building, that mimicked a nest of snakes. The tree was warm beneath his back, pulsing with life like a beating heart. He was nestled in the curve of the tree where branches reached out curling upwards towards the light. Ichigo had long ago forsaken trying to understand his inner world, so meticulously plants surviving underwater bargain little surprise. Studying the tree, he thought he could see words encrypted in the bark. They ran and chased the broad branches he was ensconced between, whispering of lost and hidden things. Ichigo tilted his head back, looking at the crown of leaves above him, a myriad of greens and golds that swayed and bobbed in the half-lights reaching the depths of the watery world he had submerged himself in. He had made a promise to his Zanpakuto and he had broken it. They deserved a better wielder than Ichigo. Someone who wasn't burdened and held down by all the pain and suffering that he had pulled them through, a wielder who could release their Zanpakuto in their full state in battle, instead of their meager half-form. Ichigo circled the thoughts in his head, memories of the war faint and tangling like vine, heard but weakly, so as if in a dream. The overbearing warmth that filled him after the surreal trip to the other plane, as he had taken to calling it, still filled him. It was like nature, in the first breaths of spring, was sauntering through his lungs, plowing through his veins, leaving blossoming seeds, crowning his head in floral night. It didn't tame the swelling vortex of emotions, nor did it simply hide them in locked chains of ice. It accepted these feelings, helped him to acknowledge that the feelings would always be there, the guilt, the hurt, the sorrow, and sometimes the anger faded. But that was okay because they weren't the pivotal movement of his whole life. the driving force between every interaction. Ichigo still used those emotions to push forward, but he didn't drown in the thick sheets of ice they imposed over his sight and lungs. He had been mistaken in thinking such, if only partially. He had held on to the emotions with an iron grip, refusing to let go or even acknowledging their presence, believing that was the key facing the future. No Rukia and by default her Zanpakuto, though beings of snow and ice, knew how to heal with their element. The soft touch of snow upon one's cheek, like a frost maiden's kiss to chase it all away, blanketing white to bury the hurt and pain. Ichigo had relied enough on those methods of coping, and while they worked, inevitably he had to face the truth, the pain, the hurt, and it came crashing down like the thunderous avalanches of fate. So Ichigo was walking through spring, trying to learn to live again, to listen to life and her message, feel it in his chest, see it in their eyes. He wouldn't give up, wouldn't let hope slip away. He was here now to stay, but not without his Zanpakuto, his soul kin. The two spirits who had supported Ichigo when he needed it the most, and when no one was around or able to, they were essential to his very being. When there were bodies lying in the fourth stone cold on the gurneys, unmoving, he had kept a silent vigil throughout the night, always whenever another one fell. Each time his soulkin had been there, standing silent and solemn in the background, or cradling his shaking form, wiping the tears away tenderly like a loving mother, with all of the grace and ease Ichigo had long forgotten in her absence. They were here with him now, even if there felt a cavernous distance of hurt between them. The fact that they were still with him assured him greatly and soothed the mounting worry that had built when he had returned to his inner world. Because there was no one else who had survived, he was the one who carried their memories and fallen dreams, and his Zanpakuto supported that weight with him. They had lost as well, felt the pain of Ichigo's soul keenly, saw blade spirits they knew fall to nothing as the wielder succumbed to death's bittersweet grasp. They were alive, and for that Ichigo was so thankful. He felt it now like a gnawing hunger pushing him forward. It had been absent so long, the only thing pushing him forwards was the need to save the future, see all those lost beneath the sands of time alive once more, breath in their lungs. His own happiness, thoughts, ending didn't matter if he could save everyone else. Now he wanted so desperately to live. That night in the rain, built upon hysteria and the ravings of his unstable mind, had helped him to realize that he wanted to see Yuzu smile, watch Orium flutter about, listen to Chad's deep rumbling baritone. He wanted to watch Kaien and Miyako be happy together with that loving warmth in their gazes, training and mentoring Rukia the brat she was. He wanted Byakuya to find the world in Hisuna even if it hurt a bit. Ichigo felt happy when his family was happy. It had always been their own happiness over his own, their safety over his life, ever since the day upon the riverbanks where he had sworn to protect his family. But Ichigo for once wanted to do more than just live for the people who made up the bonds of his soul. He wanted to live for himself, and that included his spirits. He wanted to study the books in the archives, discover new techniques, or improvements on old ones. He wanted to joke and laugh with Kisuke and the others, be mysterious and coquettish with his words as much as someone who was not the best at lying could be. Drink sake under the moonlight with this Hein or Kaien, talk about the inane things like the soft thoughts of beyond the grave. Savor the taste of Kukeiko's tea, watch Ganja laugh and ride the wild boars, walk Rungokai's bustling streets and enter random stores for the fun of it. Wanted to show the world Zanjutsu's form, and the bond that had been praised for its depth and strength. Reveal the power that he had always wielded, gifted to him by birth, and the circumstances of life. But first an apology and a good portion of groveling would be in order. Ichigo. The orange-haired Shinigami opened his eyes from where he had curled up into a neat little ball, tilting his head back slightly so he could look up at the world, and away from the voice. That deep rumbling voice, calm as the still watery blues, but lurking with wisdom and 1,000 other hints that led to wild chases and thought-provoking minutes. He could sense them stark as daylight. Shiro perched in one of the uppermost branches like a cat, staring down at them with wide unblinking eyes, Zanjutsu Asen sitting cross-legged maintaining perfect balance on the branch, a bottle of sake perched somewhere nearby. Then Ichigo opened his eyes and drew in a sharp breath of water, and wasn't that always a faintly weird sensation, because he had missed his Zanpakuto spirits even though the period they had been apart had been short compared to the near year of anguish they had spent separated. There was warmth on Zanjutsu Asen's lips, but his eyes waged war between the protective fondness he always wielded, or a deep hurt that was a crippling sight to the orange head to see on his spirit. Shiro from up in the high branches of the tree was snarling, the look wild and striking on bleached features, Ichigo knew on a baser level that Shiro was snarling at him for two entirely different reasons, but both correlated to Ichigo so that Spirit had wrapped it up in one terrifying scowl. Ichigo sighed softly, eyes tilting downwards, unable to meet the eyes of those he had so terribly wronged. Shiro's Reisu sparked and the lithe spirit scampered down the tree branches like a squirrel or perhaps like a crab scuttled. Ichigo had long ago acknowledged and accepted the peculiarities of his spirits, till he was in front of Ichigo, ebony wide blade dangling along the column of a pale throat. Ichigo didn't move, merely looked up into heated ebony sclera, and burning gold pupils. Listen, King. Ya dem fool, ya left us, abandoned us, didn't listen to us, shut us ta fuck out. Ya broke your promise. But ya also weren't in ta right frame of mind, ya were hallucinatin', mind finally flipped so far off ta deep end that ya were drownin'. And we couldn't reach ya. I am ta darkest parts of ya. Do ya fucking understand what that means? I feel it all, understand the pain better than every single other fucking person, everything ya never acknowledged I hold it because that's where it wants to hide, but I'm still standing here. We're fucking hurt, King, by your ignoring us, but also because we couldn't fucking help ya. We should have been able to reach ya, and screw some damn sense into your useless skull, but we failed and ya fell. Ichigo looked up with wide eyes, hard hammering like a jacksaw was digging around his rib cage. The accusations felt just as painful. Shiro stilled at Ichigo's lost expression, words, and thoughts bumbling about the orange-haired Shinigami's brain in an amalgamation of thoughts and sorrow. Shiro was always essentially right, even if the message was delivered harsh and blunt, like tearing the bindings off of a wound, quick and painful as hell but faded soon enough. Ichigo had already accepted that he had broken his promise, but to hear the words he already knew by heart spat out like hellfire, Ichigo struggled to draw breath. And the guilt in Shiro's voice? Ichigo should never have to hear that, not after the first time, when Ichigo had run himself ragged, and before he could save someone his own weakened body had shut down. The two had blamed themselves for not forcing Ichigo to rest while the war raged on. He couldn't afford to, people were dying every day, just as the guilt he felt had built and built, but it had never been turned his Zanpakuto's way. Instead he had forgiven them wholeheartedly, because it wasn't their fault in the end. They were a team, a unit, a trio, and they needed to work together, know each other's limits, how to aid, what to say, if they wanted to cohabitate and save the world. Ichigo frowned, eyes warm as the fluttering nature of his soul, and leaned forward to gently rest a hand against Shiro's cool cheek. The hollow-like spirit leaned into Ichigo's touch, craving the warmth and acting for all his nature like a cat. Ichigo tilted the hollow spirit's head up so that he could look into inhumane eyes, see their bond like living threads stretched between them. It's not your fault, I was careless. I didn't care what would happen, to me, to the plan, by the end I was welcoming it. I was the one who shut you two out, when I should have listened, because I had finally given it up, I'd hesitated. My body doesn't excuse my actions, ever. Shiro frowned, twisting out of Ichigo's light grasp, sending a hapless stare over his shoulder before he turned to face Ichigo once more. Stroking a hand through long orange locks and letting Reisu playfully dance between their forms, Shiro paused and took a breath before assessing his words before he spoke. Ichi, ya can't blame yourself for what happened. In the end we were all careless, and we all made mistakes. But don't ya ever think that we wouldn't want ya as our wielder. We don't care that we can't be in our released form, ya take the time to give that to us. And we don't fucking care what ya say, we went through this shit together, we want to be with you. Ichigo stared, because while he had always known this, they had reminded him several times, and Ichigo had taken it to heart, he just faltered too easily sometimes. It was what happened when you lost all trust in family and friends for however brief a time. Shiro's words had been enforced with a powerful surge of Reisu that wrapped around him and heightened the living warmth inside his chest till he felt as if the swirling emotions inside his chest was tempest waters on high. Shiro giggled breezily, eyes glowing with mirth, pulling Ichigo from his musing circling thoughts, and denial mixed with hope thought. Ichigo looked up into Shiro's eyes, the spirit staring at him like a puppy waiting for an answer. Ichigo shuddered, the spirit's words echoing in his mind and filling him with happiness. Their conformations always seemed to do such. Ichigo shrugged his shoulders and looked into those eyes, conveying his desperation to never lose the two, in addition to the deep sorrow and remorse he genuinely felt. Before Ichigo could move out of the way of the suddenly joyful, Hollows were a bit bipolar in general. Spirit's way he was glopped in a mass of white lined with black giggles still echoing faintly. Damn king, I missed seeing ya dumbstruck face. Ichigo scowled for a moment at the spirit's teasing, before a reluctant and half-amused grin curled his lips. Shiro reached up, somehow disentangling an arm from where it had been trying to crush Ichigo's rib cage, to ruffle wild orange locks before the spirit disentangled itself and darted up into the trees, though far closer than he had been previously. If Ichigo focused, he could still spot the glowing orbs shining like illuminating candlelight. With a soft incessant tug at his soul, Ichigo turned his attention to the elder Zanpakuto spirit, who was still serenely sitting composed and watching. Ichigo sometimes missed the days where Asen would stand on his pole. He did it less so now. Though Ichigo knew his spirit, and could see beneath the facade and masks, there was amusement in his eyes at the younger spirit's actions, and fondness and adoration along with the fierce protectiveness Zanjitsu Asen showed directed his way. Let it never be said that a wielder is unlike its spirits. They were all stubborn beyond reason, though Asen knew better when to succeed, and Shiro was one hell of an adversary when it came to the end of a battle, if only because of his damn stubborn refusal to submit. They were all protective, extremely so, and especially of each other. Which was a rather complicated balance that had taken them many years to find, because while they all wanted to keep the other safe, though perhaps less so for Shiro and Asen, they had to acknowledge that safe wasn't something they regularly could achieve, not with the way fate had toyed with their lives. There were other similarities. After all, they were the same soul, like Zanjitsu Asen's tea and sake preferences, Zanjitsu Shiro's more impulsive behavior or love of battle that Ichigo felt whenever he truly unsheathed his blade and let it run wild. The small minute things, and the core of their being. They were all part of the same soul, and Ichigo wouldn't have had it any other way. There were no two other beings in the expanse of the universe that Ichigo would rather have as his Zanpakuto, to share in his soul and time of living. A cough pulled Ichigo from his musing, procrastinating thoughts, and he glanced up to catch the deep cocoa of Asen's eyes beneath the tinted yellow visors. An abashed smile, slightly lopsided, settled on his lip in return. Soft chuckling followed the gesture, as Zanjitsu Asen opened the bottle of sake with the finesse all of his moves possessed, and poured the clear liquid into 3 sake cups, or at least he attempted to, with a soft frown. The liquid merely escaped the bottle to flow about their heads in a translucent glimmering state different from the water. Ichigo laughed softly at the faintly helpless look on Asen's face. Shiro had complained for years about the first time his world had been filled with water when it had happened. A moment later the elder spirit concentrated his Reisu, and the liquid refrained from floating about them like liquid mercury shining in glimmering diamonds of light, and settled into 3 small crimson cups. Ichigo took the proffered cup, savoring the taste, the burn as he swallowed, and the heat that traveled through his system afterwards. It was a brew wholly of his inner world, and was a satisfying drink no matter the time. It filled Ichigo with warmth and echoed comfort, or calmed raging nerves. Asen chuckled softly once more, the deep throaty sound tenuring pleasantly along the waves, as curly strands of hair billowed about the older spirit. Ichigo airily smiled, eyes bright as his gaze briefly flickered upwards to vermilion camouflage. There was quiet for a spare moment, full of space, and deep contemplative silence that drifted Ichigo's nerves away from grasping tendrils and let him feel the presence of his soulkin. Zanjitsu Asen seemed to consider his words, brow furrowed, and eyes studying the clear liquid, as he paused before saying, "Ichigo, I do not need to tell you anything or berate you for the grievances that have occurred, as Shiro has adequately laid it out. But I also want to reiterate, I would never choose another wielder over you. You are kind to those who need it, always willing to be empathetic and understand the cause and motive behind any villain. You have suffered so much pain, and yet you have become such a wonderful young man, a true testament to your character. You have traveled and done amazing tasks that many others would balk at the mere thought of, and gone even further than that. We have traveled together for a long time, Ichigo, though it may be extensively short in the eyes of the Shinigami, and the way of the world. But together we have persevered, your will undiminishing, until, and it is okay that happened. You've been so strong for so long, breaking shade only under cover of secrecy, and even then, rarely. But you survived, pushed through when you could have ended it, and that's what matters. You're alive." Ichigo was shudder still, rarely hearing the elder spirit speak so much in one breath, much less in a month. He was a spirit of few words, one who preferred actions and intent-lined Reisu, so when he did speak Ichigo took them to heart, even the puzzling riddles and vague answers that left him frustrated for days. The spirit had done what he had initially stated, echoing Shiro's words, with the elegant twist the older spirit always had. But to hear it again from Zanjitsu Asen was reassuring, striking home and driving the final nail on the coffin of the whole affair. Ichigo just wanted to move forward, with the healing process, let it all go. He was so mind-numbingly tired of the plaguing weight of all his emotions, and the weariness that had seemed bone-deep for ages. Ichigo sipped at the sake once more, considering his spirit who was staring at Ichigo, light pride in his chiseled features, at Ichigo's weary nod of acceptance, eyes portraying what words could not. The warm expression on Zanjitsu Asen's features caused mirth and light to bubble up within Ichigo's chest so that an echoing smile lifted his own lips. Shiro slipped from his perch a slight way up, silent except for the rather obvious clatter and rustle of leaves, till he was behind Ichigo, arms slinging around his neck. Ichigo shifted slightly at the sudden weight but otherwise didn't move, content to let the sometimes clingy spirit do as he wished. The hollow conveyed some meaning over his head to Asen before speaking. "Come on, old man, can't leave Kingy here having any more doubts that we're ever gonna leave him. 'Cause we're not." Zanjitsu conceded with a tilt of his head shifting so that he was closer to Ichigo. The orange-haired Shinigami felt himself drawn back into Shiro's cool chest as the pale spirit settled against the tree, air bubbles lazily gliding around their forms. Zanjitsu Asen settled a breath away from Ichigo, before he plucked the yellow visors off his face with a teasing smirk and set them on the bridge of Ichigo's nose, hiding his befuddled and partially knowing eyes. "Say it, Ichigo." Zanjitsu Asen commanded softly. Shiro was staring intently at Ichigo in addition to Asen's already intense eyes, and the youth sighed with a soft fond smile, shaking his head, sending water rippling about before softly he replied, "I want to live." "There, that wasn't so hard, King. Ya can think it, we can know it, but ya need to say it every once in a while." Shiro interjected, breath ghosting across the back of Ichigo's neck and sending chills chasing his spinal column. Ichigo arched a brow in amusement but otherwise said nothing, leaning back against the mirroring torso behind him. "Ichigo, you have never faced this alone, and we are still here. We'll always be beside you in facing the circumstances we have wrought. We will aid you in healing, with all our strength, all our will, the power of your soul, only because of your will to move forward." Zanjitsu added, letting his hand reach out to connect with one of Ichigo's own, warm currents of Reisu surging along his skin, heightening the sense of their bond. Ichigo cocked a smile with a tinge of mischief and bit back, "My lack of hesitance." Shiro coughed out a laugh, gold glimmering and radiating, casting the water like fey spirits. Zanjitsu arched a brow, deep-seated laughter ringing throughout his Reisu and peeking beneath the crown of swirly brown locks. "That too, Kingy, don't forget you kept both of us by ya side. Ya stuck with us, just as we are with you. And we wouldn't want it any other way." Shiro rasped out happily in response, breath ghosting his ear with the dual tone of his spirit's voice. Ichigo shook his head, as much as he was able, and reached up to lightly flick the white being on the side of his head in their gesture of fondness. Asen smiled and the two spirits' Reisu surged, whirling around him and disturbing the lazy drifting of the water currents. There were 1,000 promises there, and Ichigo let his own Reisu rise in conformation as tired eyes drifted close, home in the safety of his soul. Ya shoulda seen their faces, Ichi. It was hilarious. Everyone was trying to understand what had happened and the rooms were in complete chaos. Not to mention the past week. There's practically been lineups out ta door to see ya, cause Anohana's been pretty strict on visitors. Damn kid, ya sure have attracted quite the following. Shinji chortled, perched at the end of Ichigo's bed, in the fourth. Ichigo smiled, eyes bright and mirthful beneath a soft wave of tiredness, as he listened to the blonde captain recount the events of the days following his collapse, and subsequently the captain's meeting that had convened the late morning after. The meeting had occurred both to discuss Ichigo's state, and whether it could reach the public. The public was unable to formally acknowledge it, but rumors flew with the ease of the wind, and discussing how Aminos Grande had been able to enter Soul Society. "I don't even know how it happened. It's not like I go to the academy and lecture the students on how amazing I am. Though in hindsight Rangika has likely had a hand in it, along with Yoryuki. Have you seen the articles the Shinigami Women's Association publishes?" Ichigo surged forth with an answer to the surprising end of Shinji's flabbergasting tale. he hadn't expected to gain a following of any sort in Seoul society. He was just a lieutenant of the Shiba clan, and while that had always warranted attention from potential suitors of neighboring clans, it was nothing like the smirking blonde was suggesting. Ichigo had dealt with his fair share of admirers and fans, though more so in the First War, which had been bloody light compared to the following war, but it had always been a distant thing. The adults of Seoul society, as well as his father once he actually got involved, had served as a buffer at the time, until he was accustomed to it. Then he had been forced to learn how to deal with it on his own. Shiba-kun, getting quite the popularity, eh? Kisuke interjected from where he was seated behind Shinji, staring intently at the sheets of paperwork before him, striped bucket hat shading misty eyes from sight. Every time Ichigo saw it, a sense of rightness replaced the nagging feeling of wrong that often assaulted him. Shinji huffed, a sardonic look directed towards Kisuke, though the man took no note of it, eyes glued to the stacks of paper. Shinji's hazel eyes flashed to Ichigo, assessing the youth, before the blonde smiled, wicked sharp, rebutting and answering Kisuke's light tease with sharp wit. Well, some of it is probably that fan base of Yasichi, but most of it's people ya touched. The fans are ta type who read ta magazine and think, well, look at that slab o' meat, and batter their eyelashes at every well-toned piece of meat on the street, even the stuff at ta stalls. Ta others are those ya worked with at the academy, or helped with on a mission. I reckon ya apprentice, the redhead, was by earlier. Ichigo laughed quietly, still feeling the dead weight of his body, the heavy rise of his chest. Shinji's eyes flashed razor-sharp with concern and a cocktail of other emotions, but Ichigo was a little too out of it to try and dissect the patchwork and maze that Shinji often presented, so he dismissed it. And rather flashed a reassuring smile at the blonde. The other blonde in the room scowled, though amusement played in from beneath the cowled brim of Kisuke's hat. The scientist had been jovial and conniving enough for the beginning of the visit, but had quickly settled in the corner and pulled out a stack of paperwork kept on his personal. Ichigo had long stopped questioning his habits. He had once pulled a full-blown handsaw out of his sleeve. The man was a scientist and an introvert at that, so his subsequent shutdown from the rest of the world after being well and truly sociable, was to be expected, and the few scathing or teasing remarks were enough for Ichigo. You should have seen Shinji, Ichigo. He was pacing like a frantic father for 3 nights straight, mumbling under his breath about how he was going to kill someone, which is relatively normal these days now that I think about it. Shinji glowered at Kisuke as Ichigo laughed once more in a constrained manner, appreciating the dynamic and humor between the two, in addition to the information of how Shinji had humorously spent the past few days. The two had been acquainted well enough before the incident, though Ichigo knew that only through the gossip, and their own tales they had imparted in the future. But the holification had brought them all together, showed leadership and charisma, helped the two bond over how best to deal with their little hollow problem, as well as the topic of Aizen. Kisuke ignored the sour expression, immediately followed by a more childish one Shinji flung at the man before turning to face Ichigo with an eye roll. The orange-haired Shinigami only laughed and shook his head helplessly. So, what are ya plannin' to do once ya escape? Shinji asked, trying to draw the subject away from the laughing matter, such as himself, and his worrying. Ichigo's gaze swerved to stare out the window, as if seriously considering bolting through the small porthole. Although it seemed Anohana had learned her lesson from the multiple previous times Ichigo had been able to escape through a window and stay out till dark, and had given him a room with an incredibly meager-sized window. That however hadn't stopped Ichigo before. In his defense, he had never returned injured from one of his little escapades, tired yes, injured no. The fourth made him feel claustrophobic after too long, cramped in the small rooms, with endlessly white sterile walls. When he escaped he really just walked around Seoul society, more so in the outer districts where the forests were thick and he could think undisturbed. His body however on this occasion was still too beat, from the rather sleepless week before, so he was halted from such activities for the time. Ichigo considered Shinji's question. What did he want to do once free? He had a list of people he needed to apologize/console, either for worrying them half to death, not confiding in them, or speaking to them. In Kyan's case, his brother deserved heartfelt thanks, and all the adoration Ichigo realistically could heap on the man, because he could have given up, though Ichigo knew that wasn't in his character in the slightest. Instead he had saved Ichigo, had taken the information he was from the future rather well, They had only spoken for a short while when Ichigo first woke, and Kion had been manhandled away to complete work since, but he didn't doubt they would be having a talk. He knew his brother was much the same as Ichigo, and would have done it no matter what because they were our family, but that wasn't going to stop Ichigo from hugging the man fiercely when he was able. Doctors had said hugging was a good thing if Ichigo recalled correctly. He would have to speak to Byakuya as well. The thought was one that sent his nerves racing, but he calmed them with a soft breath, Chad's assurances beating at his pulse. He didn't have to bring up any feelings, they could remain friends as Ichigo wished. No, what also concerned him was the likely annoyance that Byakuya felt, in that Ichigo should have pulled the noble heir away from his dinner so Ichigo could talk to him. In any case they would likely iron everything out over tea, where they could catch up as they hadn't been able to in a while, first the Vizard training, and then the rush of settling into work once more. He was happy at the thought of sharing tea with Byakuya again, and just speaking of simple things, or talking about thought-provoking subjects, such as the new militia instated in Rungokai. In the end, he knew he wanted to heal, take some time for himself, walk around Rungokai, pause, and reconsider the journal, speak with Sosuke about the future a small bit. But also talk to someone, likely Anohana, like the therapy he never took in the mortal world. Ryukin had advised it for all the teens who'd been in the war. Ichigo believed he had managed well enough on his own, and no one cared to push it. Talk to Kukeku, try to console her for my grave misdeed, and avoid her wrath. Eat Ganju's cooking, Kami knows that it's better than hospital food. Hug Kion when I see him, then likely get slapped by him. Heal. Ichigo responded with, deciding not to share the rather collective miasma of things he wanted to do in his free time. Shinji smiled encouragingly and nodded, a touch of sympathy on his features at the thought of Kukeku's wrath. While the man himself had never truly faced it, he had likely heard more than enough horrifying tales. Kisuke looked up briefly and there was an aghast expression painting his features, before it devolved into his coy smirk, and in that sly innocent tone he said, "I'll pray for you." The bastard had dealt with Kukeku's rage before, how could he not when he was friends with Yoriyuki? There had been a few incidents from what the Shihoan princess had shared with one of those teasingly amused Hellcat grins, and was only far too happy he wasn't on the receiving end. Ichigo shot a scowl towards the captain of the 12th, who brushed it off with a merry tip of his hat. Quiet settled for a few as Ichigo turned to stare at the window with a touch of longing in his eyes. Shinji shifted into another abstract position within the visitor's chair, leg raised haphazardly in the air, while another hand came to cushion his head. Kisuke had shifted his eyes to the paperwork once more, humming softly under his breath, with a tune that ticked like clockwork and felt like mechanics. "Ichi." Shinji spoke softly and Ichigo glanced over to see the blonde staring at Kisuke, eyes locked in wordless communication before they turned back to the orange-haired Shinigami sequestered in the medical bed. "We're sorry, we shoulda have done something more when we noticed your difficulties with sleepin'. And we should have checked up on ya once we returned. We saw ya at dinner, and even though we noted your deteriorating state we didn't do anything. We're both deeply sorry for that." Ichigo opened his mouth a few times, trying to put too many thoughts into words before closing it. He stared at Shinji and Kisuke, noting the deep sorrow and apologetic swell in their souls, reaching out through their eyes. Ichigo was slightly stunned to have received such an apology, as he hadn't cast the blame on anyone but himself. "They have well-meaning intentions, Ichigo. They are guilty that you are in the fourth due to their own ignorance, and the ignorance of Soul Society as a whole, and so wish to apologize." Zanjutsu's timber floated along the channels of his mind, and while Ichigo did not need the explanation, he welcomed it all the same. It cleared his thoughts into an orderly path that he could follow. Tilting his chin upwards so he could look the two captains, who he held immense respect for, in the eyes, Ichigo responded, "You don't need to apologize, it was my own fault. I should have paid attention to my body, or talked to someone sooner. Nevertheless, thank you both for the apology, but do not blame yourselves. I don't want a horde of people protectively stalking me because of one incident." Shinji and Kisuke looked up sharply at his words, bodies tense, eyes grim. They looked like they wanted to protest Ichigo's denial of their grievances, but Ichigo continued to speak over them until the message reached home. He ended on a light note, tweaking smiles from their lips, and brightening the dreary take the atmosphere had adapted at Shinji's solemn confession. Kisuke chuckled under his breath, and Shinji smirked, likely imaging the horrifying situation Ichigo had laid out. He didn't doubt already that Kyan was debating posting a guard on him at all times, if not to have someone monitor him rather than protect him, then to soothe Kyan's own paranoia. Silence descended once again, comfortable and light. Ichigo felt as if an imaginary weight had been lifted from his chest, one that had aided in the heavy feeling submerging his lungs as he drew faint breaths. Their visit had been welcomed, in the deafening silence of the fourth broken only by the outside bustle, and Hanatero's intermediary visits, and Ichigo had been dead shocked to see Hanatero of all people, though word had reached his ear that he had been one of the few people to soothe his Reisu. Which had been both ironic and endearing. He had only woken the morning of the day before, under the pulling sensation of Kyan's tidal Reisu rushing around and eagerly tangling with his own presence. Anohana had been a blessing in keeping the guest to a minimal, but it seemed luckily the news of his awakening hadn't spread, and he had only seen his Teiko and Lisa the night before. Still Kisuke and Shinji's visit was welcome. They were a sense of home, after the month training with the Vizard, and Shinji's own wild Reisu calling of dusty cities, and endless suns had tamed mild hysteria and worry with the familiar press of instinct. Seoul society was still home and would always be so, all of its inhabitants included, even the particular ones he didn't like, but it was distant still at the time he had fallen, whereas the Vizard were still fresh. A knock on the door disturbed Ichigo of his musings, and he glanced up to where the shoji door slid open to reveal Anohana's pleasant countenance. Her trained gaze surveyed the room, taking note of the guests with a passing fancy before landing on Ichigo. Her gaze pinned him down, and he let himself submit beneath her will, too tired to fight with ragging fire eyes as he usually did. The captain of the fourth directed her gaze to the visitors once more and pursued her lips, a faint apology in her eyes before she asked, "I'm going to have to ask you two to leave now. I need to speak with Ichigo, now that he is fairly coherent." Shinji flashed Ichigo an apologetic wide grin, untangling himself, before he sauntered out of his chair, throwing a cocky glance back at Anohana. The female captain only shook her head at the other's actions before directing her gaze to Kisuke. The scientist looked up from where he was gathering the paperwork into his sleeves with a sigh and sly wink in Ichigo's direction. "We'll see ya soon, Ichi. Best of luck dealing with ya family." Shinji caroled to Ichigo's small wave, before he stalked out the door whistling a cheery tune under his breath. Kisuke rolled his eyes before drawing his sight to Ichigo. He said, "I hope you feel better, Ichigo." With the brief parting, the enigmatic man followed in Shinji's footsteps at an ambling pace, throwing a small wave over his shoulder. Ichigo let a faint smile eschew his lips before he turned his attention to Anohana, who held a vaguely amused expression, one eyebrow arched with humor. The peaceful expression slipped from her features as she glided over to one of the chairs, and settled herself there. Ichigo grimaced hard, heavy in his chest. He had been dreading this encounter, all the while wishing to be done with it. The female captain flashed him a reassuring and gentle smile, steepling her fingers across her thighs so she could consider Ichigo with a critical eye. "Let's talk, Shiba-san." X. Chapter 32, Acatlepsy. X. Ichigo blanched, and closed his eyes to take a reassuring breath at the striking words that sent panic fluttering about. Opening his eyes, he studied Anohana, who remained patiently seated in the likely uncomfortable visitor's chair. There was a peaceful, welcoming expression on her features, but otherwise they were impassive. If Ichigo studied her eyes, he thought he could see a glimmer of curiosity and concern, but it was hard to tell with the imposing women, and the mask of impassiveness she usually possessed. Ichigo let his breath leave him in a diminished manner, feeling his lungs deflate as the air passed his lips, as he considered her request, which was really more of a demand, however sure Ichigo was that she wouldn't push him, if he wasn't ready. He knew he needed to speak to someone. He had confided as much with his Zanpakuto and to himself. And while he had inevitably in a rather disastrous attempt shared it with Kyan, Ichigo knew he needed to share it with someone else, more particularly a healer. Kyan was a great older brother, a role in Ichigo's life that had never been filled before, understanding, caring, if a bit overprotective. Ichigo knew he could go to Kyan for anything. They had become close over the long years they had known each other. Nights spent over glasses of sake, sharing ambiguous stories, or contemplating society for all its flaws, or life in all its wonders. But as much as Kyan would endeavor to aid Ichigo in healing from the scars of his past, in the end the lieutenant of the 13th was not a healer. He had confided in others, the Suteiko who had taken it unflinchingly, and thereafter seemed to consider Ichigo his protege, or nephew, and he had alluded to the truth with the two scientists thrice over. He was pretty sure they had caught on, but they hadn't confronted him yet, which Ichigo was thankful for. But it did not deter the simplicity of the matter. Anohana was a healer, she was also a veteran, had seen a war and all its trials, someone who was experienced and not close within his heart. He suspected that was a temporary matter. He had never been particularly close to the women in his own timeline, though he had had his fair share of encounters within the 4th Division. Whether cause of his own injury or others was a variant at the time, though more often than not it was Ichigo who was injured. He had mourned her passing, felt it keenly as any other member of the Godi 13 he had known. But it wasn't like in this timeline. They had already met a few times. Ichigo had never been prompted to speak of his experiences, after that first declaration before he had confronted Yamgiai. Instead she had served tea, chatted about recent inquiries into the field of medicine. Ichigo had shared what knowledge and interests in the field he retained from the days where his dad worked in the clinic. It had been a break from Soul Society as whole, a chance to distance himself from the time travel aspects of his life, in addition to his friends. If asked, Ichigo would say he trusted her. She reminded him of a motherly figure, or that of an aunt, with the way she acted around Ichigo. There was care and compassion in her eyes, instead of the cold clinical detachedness he was familiar with. Maybe the women saw the scarred soul he was beneath the layer of strength, or maybe she recognized a veteran like herself but far too young. In the end, Ichigo believed he could trust her with his secret. The only thing stopping him was his own fear and hesitance. Ichigo, hesitation is not who you are. You know you can trust her, then do so. She will be able to aid you in healing. Zanjitsu Asen advised, the deep baritone thrumming the channels of his mind, soothing his nerves and helping Ichigo to push forward. Anohana was not necessarily a therapist, but Ichigo didn't doubt her ability to help him. She was a healer first and foremost, one who would find a way if necessary. She had come prepared to accept whatever words and truths Ichigo threw at her. Considering the woman once more, he caught the corner of her eyes where they lingered on the window, taking in the pleasant nature scene, drawing her attention. Anohana glanced up, eyes steely and strong. She studied Ichigo's own determination, in return of his challenging eyes. You won't be able to speak of anything we talk about, right? At least not without permission. Ichigo asked patiently and a touch unsure, worrying the corner of his lip in thought. He knew practically all medical procedures like the back of his hand, but that didn't stop the small sliver of doubt. Anohana nodded, a vaguely amused smile painting her lips. She replied, patient confidentiality, Ichigo-san. Ichigo nodded, expecting the answer. He turned his gaze to the window to collect his thoughts. Wondering how to approach the situation and spell it out for her, there was a vast worth of memories and experiences that he could talk about with her. Ichigo assumed though that he would likely have to attend a few, read many, sessions with the strict captain, which he wasn't wholly opposed to, before they would even begin to scratch the surface of the deep tomb of issues Ichigo had. Decision mostly made, and lacking any hesitance or further energy to muster such, Ichigo began. The first time I met you was when I woke up in the 4th after Aizen had revealed himself as the grand mastermind behind Rukia Kukaki's execution. I, as any teenager, possessing the conceived notion of immortality and recklessness in the face of death, had invaded Soul Society with a small group of close-knit friends to rescue the young Kukaki. After a stay in the mortal realm, where she loaned me her powers to save my family. Anohana looked up sharply at his words, eyes surprised and studying Ichigo and his demure speech, as if trying to complete a puzzle without all the pieces and a whole ton of confetti involved for fun. Ichigo ran a hand through his hair and continued, I come from a future, one in which Aizen Sosuke betrayed Soul Society and created a legion of hollows equal in power to those in commandment of the Godi 13, a world in which the Vizard were banished to the mortal world. In which a war occurred, lasting 3 long years, at which in the finale of it all, I gave up my powers, my soul kin, to defeat the megalomaniac. For a year I was without my powers, till they were returned to me. Soon after we were thrown into another war, one against a race long thought to be exterminated by the command of the Central 46 and the Godi 13. The war was long, somewhere around 20 years, I can't recall. In the end, I was one of the only survivors in a world that was perishing, all balance destroyed, so I ripped apart time and space to redo it all, to save the future and everyone else. Silence abounded throughout the room along with a thin curtain of Reisu, heavy and oppressive, after Ichigo's rather stunning confession. Briefly Ichigo glanced at Anohana, seeing the masked shock and horror that played upon her features, before he tipped his head up to look at the bland ceiling above. He could feel his chest tighten, his throat was dry, though that could have been from all the talking, a sickly feeling bubbling up in his gut, the world seemed to close in around him. Ichigo gripped the sheets in a death hold, focusing on deep breaths and Zanjutsu's calming presence. Speaking of it in such blunt terms was difficult, knowing every word was being assessed, picked apart, seeing it all briefly in his mind's eyes. He chased away reoccurring thoughts, and focused on light breathing before he turned his head to regard Anohana once more. A considering light was in her eyes, it played with a magnitude of other emotions that Ichigo couldn't decipher, but could partially detect in the downturned corners of her lips, and furrowed brow. She seemed at a loss of how to respond, and Ichigo couldn't blame her, lost himself on how to proceed, what next to say. They remained in silence for a few more minutes studying each other, and thinking over Ichigo's words. I guess I can say I was not expecting such a conformation. However, Ichigo, I accept you, and the truth in your words. Anohana spoke softly, a touch hesitant though Ichigo barely picked up on it. Her words brought a smile to his lips, and had warmth surging through his chest, deflating the tension thrumming in his body. As much as experience had proven otherwise, Ichigo still always held that tiny sliver of doubt that one day someone would refuse to believe his words, or would laugh at his pain. So, the conformation, no matter how many times received, was always supportive, and welcomed. Ichigo looked up from where his gaze had drifted to the sheets, obviously searching for the meaning of life in them, as was a common occurrence. He flashed Anohana a grateful smile, eyes as bright as he could muster with the exhaustion still hanging onto his system like lead. The female captain's countenance brightened slightly at the positive response from Ichigo, and the corners of her lips tilted upwards faintly. Her hands shifted in their placement upon her lap, and she considered her words for a few moments. Ichigo, content to let her, preferring to endure the silence, talking took too much energy in any case it seemed, and let Anohana lead the conversation. Ichigo, in the end your healing depends on you. You choose what we can or can't talk about, and how I can help you. If you merely wish to use me as your sounding board and relay all your memories of the wars, then we can do so. However, if you wish my aid in healing, then we can work together on comprehensive strategies moving towards a healthier you. The decision is ultimately yours. Ichigo blinked and slowly comprehended Anohana's words. In the end, he had never really considered how he could heal with Anohana. Talking it out had always been one of the leading ideas, but as was normal, he hadn't formed a plan to follow through with. In the end, she was correct, it was his decision. His choice whether he actually wanted to heal, or merely talk, which would still help him heal, but in a far less comprehensive way. Turning his attention to his Zanpakuto, Ichigo asked their opinions, hoping they could aid him as they always had in making a rational decision. Kami knows rational was never normally part of any planning. Go for old psychopath's method, she knows what she's doing and ya need to stop moping and get ya arse in gear. Shiro called out before Asen could speak. He could sense the older spirit's irritation at the gesture, though there was also familiar amusement. He shook his head in humored amusement at Shiro's blithe and blunt tactic, though he couldn't deny that such a tactic often worked, and while he was sadistic in his delivery at times, he was always truthful. Ichigo sent the mental equivalent of a thumbs up to Shiro, before he turned his attention to Zanjutsu Asen. I believe that following her course of recommendation would be the best path, Ichigo. Additionally, you will always have Kaien or anyone else to speak to, but Anohana is a medical professional and may be able to provide greater assistance with analyzation and coping methods. The older spirit confided in Ichigo, voice warm with his support for the plan and his wielder's courage in seeking out help. Ichigo nodded, refusing to contemplate and hedge the decision any longer. Hesitance always a foul thing indeed, slowing life, and costing a century in the blink of an eye. He caught Anohana's open gaze and nodded before saying, I would like to work together on developing a proper method of treatment. It would be greatly appreciated, Anohana Teiko, and your aid would be invaluable. Anohana grinned, eyes pleased at Ichigo's answer before a thoughtful look flitted onto her features. Ichigo let the women think for a moment, idly searching the room for Zanjutsu's material form, wishing to seek comfort and support in their presence in his hands. The blade was propped up against the wall next to his cot, sheath catching the bleary sunlight in rippling hues of ebony. Casting a curious glance at Anohana, wondering if she would permit him holding his blade, Ichigo shrugged, never one to care for the rules, before he leaned over and grasped the hilt of his Zanpakuto. The material hummed beneath his fingers, and Ichigo settled a touch more at the comforting weight of his battle partner in his hands. Ichigo could feel the women's stare like a magnet, and with a touch of reluctance turned his head to face her. There was a bemused expression on her lips, but it quickly slipped away to be replaced with a deeper expression befitting a serious conversation. I think for treatment we need to cover all aspects of your life, from before the war, to the space in between. As while you likely have trauma from the war, we need to assess how your life before and in between affected performance on and off the battlefield. What I need to figure out in depth is your character. Are you empathetic? Humorous? Kind? Merciless? Once I know you and how you deal with situations, it will hopefully be easier to develop a strategy. We can start by talking about whatever you see fit, analyze it, and then discuss solutions to problems you are currently facing, and how they may relate to your past experiences. Anohana suggested as their treatment plan, with a sharp nod and a patience in her form that suggested she could wait for Ichigo to digest the multiple servings of semi-complicated. Ichigo considered the plan. It was broad and open with room for shifting and growing, and of course it wasn't set in stone. He would be able to choose what they talked about, how they analyzed, and what he could do to help himself heal. It made sure both he and Anohana were shouldering the responsibility and monumental task of trying to help him recover. It helped to ease some of Ichigo's tension. They could adjust to fit their needs, and the treatment he needed. A half-smile tilted Ichigo's lips and he said, "That sounds like a good plan." His voice drifted out a lot hoarser than he was expecting. Anohana faintly winced before passing a glass of water to Ichigo. He drank the soothing liquid slowly, knowing better from far too many experiences in the past future, and wished there was some tea, and a general lack of hospital food, before setting the glass down. Anohana had a concerned smile painting her features, asking if he required any assistance. Ichigo responded with a faint shrug and attempted to pass the meager message that he would be okay eventually, or at least that was the belief he firmly held onto, though time healing all wounds was a rhetoric in his case. Anohana considered Ichigo once more in the silence before she asked, "Would you be okay with starting today? We don't have to get into anything too heavy, we can just begin, lay some foundation." Ichigo frowned considering her question, and wanting to delay the inevitable. But it was just that, inevitable, and since the female captain was already firmly ensconced in one of the visitor chairs, Ichigo knew he had little justification to say otherwise. However, Anohana was right. This was his decision. He couldn't base it on whether or not she was necessarily easily available and standing in front of him. It was his choice. He had to be ready for it. Ichigo knew he was tired of the weight of the future, and all the emotions he carried on his shoulders. He also knew that he was ready to start seeking help. It all boiled down to if he was ready to step forward and take it. It was always easy to think and plan, but to do it was another thing entirely, Ichigo thought with a sigh. Zanjitsu Asan's presence rippled across Ichigo's senses, approving of the time he had taken to think things over. If he wasn't ready, not truly, then the healing would be pointless, but also encouraging him to move forward. "We can begin today." Ichigo sounded with a barely there smile. Anohana nodded, and pursed her lips for a moment before a open and encouraging smile settled on her features. She briefly flared her Reisu with a wink before she asked, "How about we start with identifying some of the problems you're facing first?" Ichigo nodded and sighed, running a hand, though his tangled hair, as he thought of the multitude of problems he faced near constantly. It was a long and extensive list stretching far beyond physical ailments, and a complexity of psychological knots that would send any other sane person running. But Anohana was not any other person, nor was she particularly sane. I always feel tired, like even when I get a good rest, which is rare, and it's not like my body is tired, but my soul? And I know I have chronic insomnia. Sleep doesn't come easy to me, if at all, some nights. When it does, I suffer from extensive nightmares, that are more memories than nightmares sometimes. I know I'm underweight, and that is likely due to my reduced appetite. I can barely stomach large meals, and sometimes can't even manage food. I'm often depressed, finding a lack of will to get out of bed, much less continue living. I suffer from flashbacks, and can be triggered by certain events, places, or even people. Sometimes I am also reduced to panic attacks, though they are short-lived thanks to the aid of my Zanpakuto. I have problems with my emotions, preferring apathy with most people, so it hurts less, and I often wish to avoid relationships altogether. In addition to also having mood swings, I can go from happy and at peace, to grim and sorrowful within the space of a minute. I have major trust issues, and slight separation anxiety. I guess I should reveal my bloodline to you, might help in the future. My mother was a Quincy, though she was a half-blood, her rasu was incredibly pure. My father was a Shinigami, a captain who dissented to marry my mother. In the event of their meeting, a hollow attacked my mother. The only way to save her was to lock the hollow from within her soul, as I understand it at least. As her firstborn, the hollow in my mother's soul was transferred to me. I was getting better, before the incident happened, that is. I was finally getting into the habit of eating more, and I was getting better sleep than I had in years. The nightmares, flashback, depression, all of it was still there. But it wasn't harsh and they occurred in less frequently. But with my reintroduction to the Vizard, the stress of training them, and living with people who were like family, I relapsed, badly, and I didn't seek help when I needed to. There was utter silence in the small private room in the fourth as Ichigo finished speaking in a mostly detached sort of way, akin to how he would deliver a report within only the slight giveaway in his voice. He felt raw and open, slightly dejected in admitting how his recovery had been progressing towards something, and how it had all come crashing down because of his refusal to seek help. A feeling of chiding, or Shiro's glare simmered from their bond, and Ichigo shook his head with apologetic smile, remembering and understanding well their discussions about placing blame. Anohana was stone still in her seat, face blank, but her eyes were two raging storms, crashing with such fervor that Ichigo didn't dare to look any longer lest he never escape such a storm. The tense atmosphere that was held like a breath, was broken as a timid knock sounded on the shoji door. Their sudden, though likely unexpected visitor, waited a moment before sliding the door open. They stepped inside with a tray of tea and matching mugs balanced on their arm. As if sensing the frigid aura of the room, the division member rushed over quiet as a mouse and set the teaware onto a side table. With a respectful nod to a still frozen Anohana, the subordinate scurried from the room. A fond amused smile twisted his lips, even as his gut curled with unease at having blatantly revealed near everything about himself. It's not like he wouldn't in time anyway. It was unnerving after keeping secrets for so long, and especially when it wasn't a burst of emotions in the form of words, or taking the space of a breath. It was detached, analyzed, and thoughtful retelling, or sharing. He turned and cradled the Cornish blue teapot, before pouring the steaming liquid into the two matching mugs. Anohana was still ridged in her chair, likely processing the crazy information Ichigo had dropped on the women like an atomic device, with all of the devastating effects. He felt a touch of guilt at provoking such a reaction, but knew that if anyone could handle it, Anohana would be able to. Spooning a bit of sugar into Anohana's tea, as he knew the woman liked from past experience, Ichigo took his own black and lifted the mug to his lips. It was a deep heady brew that sent heat pooling in his chest and soothed the ache of his throat. For a tiny moment Ichigo could pretend he wasn't in the fourth disclosing his life story, and seeking medical aid. For a moment, he could almost sense the Shiba mansion, Kaien beside him as they watched the early sun grace the land. He blinked and the sensation was gone. He smiled sadly at the odd pang in his heart. It had been quite a while since he had had a home to miss. It was a funny irony to be homesick for a place, instead of a person or a place that didn't exist for a change. Beside the bed, Anohana shifted the shuffle of her shiakusho, alerting Ichigo to her return to the realm of the aware. Refocusing on the captain, he watched as she absently picked up the teacup, and stirred before sipping the burning liquid. There was silence as the two sipped their tea for a quiet moment, before Anohana steeled herself and said, "I wasn't expecting that. Excuse my momentary lack of functioning within the outside world. I was speaking to my Zanpakuto as well as considering the information you had shared." Anohana pursed her lips, and her eyes twinkled with allusions to the easy weave of her words. Ichigo flashed a faintly apologetic smile in her direction, but the women waved it away with a flippant wave. "After discussion with my Zanpakuto, I think I've thought of a few solutions, as well as responses to certain issues you addressed. I think though that it would be wise and beneficial to have cohesion between the 12th and 4th Division, so that our efforts within the field of medicine, and in correlation to you, can be as successful as possible." Ichigo perked up at Anohana's mention of solutions, happy that the women had been able to think of something. Surprise colored his features faintly at her suggestion of working with the 12th Division. While it had occurred to him before, and the two divisions had worked together in the past as far as Ichigo remembered, he hadn't necessarily considered implementing it in his own case. Though he knew as soon as it was suggested to Kisuke it would be accepted, the man underneath his contrived mask of faint worry was likely flailing about in guilt, and at the same time trying to solve how he could help Ichigo. Anohana looked pleased at Ichigo's positive reaction, and with a nod she continued after restlessly twisting her fingers, "For sleep there's only so much I can do, though I will inquire to Kisuke about working on an herbal-based sleep solution, one that would provide dreamless sleep would probably be preferable, no? For your appetite, I would consider a dietary plan," Ichigo scoffed, and she raised an eyebrow. He hastily defended himself by saying, "It's just never worked before, like writing in a diary, I just can't focus on it, or I am a touch too rebellious to follow them." Anohana frowned disapprovingly for his interruption, but there was a knowing pleasure in her eyes as she continued, "Your dietary plan would consist of foods recommended for portion size, as well as nutrition. Additionally, I would think it would be beneficial to have you eating with other people, which can be arranged between the Shibas and your captain." The smile that settled on her lips was familiar in its hidden menace, and Ichigo repressed the urge to sigh and drag his hand through his unruly hair. That look sealed one's doom, and more particularly Ichigo's. It wasn't that Ichigo didn't like eating, he still missed Orium and Yuzu's cooking all the time, but the plan, involving both people and portion sizing, was constricting. Shiro was cackling within the background of his mind, the distortion of his voice echoing like a trench. "She's got ya hook, line and sinker," Shiro called out gleefully, and Ichigo had to agree with the spirit. That was how they had managed to stuff any food into him during the last war, not the portion sizing, but forcing him to eat with other people. And if it was with the Shibas, Ichigo knew he would never escape a meal, and he wouldn't if it was Ganju cooking, and if his captain was roped into the whole idea he would be mother-hen to the 7th layer of hell if he delayed lunch by 1 minute. It was still surprising how protective Jushiro and Shunsui were in this timeline. Still, it was a good plan, and obviously despite claiming ignorance Anohana knew him a bit better than she let on. With a reluctant sigh Ichigo nodded his agreement to the plan. A pleased expression formed on Anohana's shapely features. "We can't do too much about flashbacks or triggers, unfortunately. We can hope that with time the flashbacks will decrease in numeracy, as you were saying was beginning to occur, and we can eliminate potential triggers if they are known. Our sessions will help work out your mental state, and hopeful some other issues will be resolved from there." She paused and considered Ichigo keenly for a moment, eyes warm and open, before she continued in a much softer tone, "If you ever feel the need to talk, or are having an attack of some kind, don't be afraid to contact me, even if it's in the middle of the night. There are always people who want to help you, Ichigo, you just need to seek them out." Anohana frowned softly while she spoke, her meaning conveyed through the sincerity in her eyes and her words, illustrating the best solution she was able to find, especially for a rather difficult patient, as well as offering support. Ichigo smiled and nodded his thanks, her words igniting inside his chest. Casually he sipped the still scorching tea, as he waited for Anohana to ask the question, furrowing her brow. "Ichigo, is your power above that of the Suteikos?" The female captain asked hesitantly, gaze affixed to Ichigo's features, locked onto his eyes, as if compelling him to answer her. Ichigo sighed. He was doing a lot of sighing, and ran a hand through his hair, letting his other hand drift to grasp Zanjitsu's hilt before he replied, "Yes, my power level is above that of the Suteiko, it's even above that of the Soul King. I always had abnormally high Reisu for a human, then again, I wasn't truly human." Anohana glared faintly, rejecting his words and making Ichigo pause in his explanation. He flashed his arms up in a sign of defense and apology before he continued, "My life in retrospective seems a constant series of battles, with small pockets of peace in between. When my mother was alive it was the bullies at school, after her death, it was a fight to find the will to live, and to care for my sisters. I would often fight in the streets to defend myself, and my best friend. Meeting Rukia, we fought together. Once she was taken I fought to save her. Challenging the Espada, the Hollows equal to the power level of the Godei 13 captains, on their home turf, over and over into a bloody war. Then false peace, no more big battles, blood, and endless sand. But crushing loneliness, a grey and empty life. and to receive my powers once more only to be launched back into battle against new enemies. And in the end it is a fight against time, and events that should never have been, a fight to keep moving, keep surviving. In the end, I suppose that's life, fighting constantly to survive in big and small ways. Ichigo finished slightly out of breath, and took a spare few moments to regain his breath, and sip the still warm tea. Anohana sat ramrod straight once more, eyes narrowed, and there was a certain kind of cold fury there, that while not directed at Ichigo still sent shivers down his spine. Ichigo, you're telling me that in a war that was of our own making and matter, you fought for us? In both wars? And we let you? Take no offense, but you were a child, how could we? Anohana asked, deadly soft, her tone sharp as razor wires, though Ichigo knew they weren't directed his way. When she put it that way it sounded bad, and the truth of the matter was it had been bad. He had been young, a teenager, and his whole life had been stolen away from him in the 2 wars that had spanned what could have been his life. He had been suspended from strings for so much of his life, taught and snapped with the whim of whatever manipulator saw fit to think themselves a master of life. He had gained in the war, but he had also lost immensely. But Ichigo knew if the circumstances were the same, he still would have fought with them, with not for, or as their unjustly messiah, because they were his friends, and if they had fallen who would have protected the world? His sisters. Shinji had always been a cynic, and had spat the matter out with blatant disgust and heavy remorse in one of his rants, when it was just the 2 of them, speaking, talking, reminiscing. Ichigo had been more than stunned the first time it had all been laid bare. Another manipulation in the ever-growing, ever-crossing webs of manipulations that had seemed to constrict his very breathing. In the end Ichigo still fought for Soul Society even knowing what they had done. They supposedly needed my power, in the end I was okay with it, because if Soul Society had fallen, the Quincy or Aizen would have gone after the mortal realm eventually. Still times were rough, and poor decisions were made. Ichigo defended in a tired voice, there was strength and conviction behind his words, but it was held down by the weight of the truth. He had been 15 when he first entered the war. Anohana studied Ichigo, sizing him up, as if asking herself what made Ichigo tick, why he would fight for an obviously corrupt society. Whatever she found seemed positive as she lightly shook her head, a glimmer of bemusement under the crown of her hair. Only you, Ichigo, I can believe only you would be capable of all you've done. Your will to push forward, forgive the machinations of others, seek allies and enemies as you have done with Aizen. It could be fate or destiny if you choose to believe, but as you stated it was your own will to rewrite your ending that sent you through time. Anohana summarized his whole character in a few lines. Ichigo felt a smile unbidden slip onto his lips at her words. They were endearing, and supportive of what Ichigo had done and who he was. Zanjutsu's pleased hum thrummed along their bond, illuminating to Ichigo what his spirits thought of the captain of the Fourth's words. Thank you, Anohana-san. Ichigo replied with a wink and a hint of mischief coloring his voice. She quirked an eyebrow but said nothing else, her reisu betraying the content and amusement she was feeling. Silence settled over the room once more, only the soft rush of the outside world disturbing the calm, a contrast to the earlier tension that had settled like a heavy fog. He was tired, in a way that suggested emotional exhaustion, though physically his body was still beat. It was a better emotional exhaustion than the kind he was used to. This was like the exhaustion after a particularly good workout, warm and still thrumming with energy even as it settled into sleepiness. Ichigo blinked a few times, content to stay awake for a while longer. Anohana looked up from where her gaze had drifted to her hands. There was a question on her lips, but hesitance furrowing her brow. Ichigo tilted his head curiously, open to whatever question she would throw his way. Is there anything else you would like to talk about today, Ichigo? We can talk about an event, or even a person. And Ichigo, you don't have to use anyone's names if you don't want to. Anohana asked benignly and without force, undemanding of Ichigo's continued therapy but open to continuing. Ichigo considered the question. Did he feel like talking? He was emotionally tired already, but he felt as if he could continue talking. It was like a flow of water, once released, not easily stopped. He wanted to talk about his family, indulge in the small musings when he thought of them in the twilight, fond and heartbreaking. He nodded and a wicked light flashed in his eyes, though it was undermined by a faint pleading and gentleness, as he said, I'll talk, but I want to hear about you too. It's only fair. Anohana chuckled lowly under her breath. Her aura of doom was back, but Ichigo could inordinately sense her lack of killing intent. He had asked, because Ichigo genuinely wanted to know about the female captain. She had always been a mystery even in his own timeline, but she was kind and genuine, even with all the sociopathic tendencies. If Ichigo was going to have to talk to her often, he wanted to know her. When Anohana finally stilled in her mirth, she lifted her head up and accommodated his request with a nod. A wide bright smile flitted across Ichigo's lips as he leaned his head back against the pillows, staring up at the ceiling and gathering his thoughts. Who did he want to talk about? He could talk about anyone in the whole of Soul Society, but it would probably be wiser for the time being to stay away from members of Soul Society. His friends and family had been those closest to his heart, and the ones who he likely held some of the deepest pain for. If he was going to attempt to talk, he might as well go all out. Ichigo decided with a frown, images of their smiles drifting to the forefront of his mind. Zanjutsu's reassuring Reisu washed over him, supporting Ichigo and giving him the courage and strength to speak. I had 2 younger sisters, they were twins and were 4 years younger. Their names were Yuzu and Karen. Yuzu had blonde hair, and she smiled like our mother. Radiant. It was a smile that could brighten anyone's day, warm and so full of love. She was always a gentle soul, happy cooking and caring for the family after Kaa-san passed. But she had a spine of steel underneath the passive exterior. There was a time where I hadn't returned for a week, and, well, she was the one to slap some sense into everyone. As she grew older, she grew into a woman, and men would always ask to date her. She always cared so much for our family. I protected her always, and in return she was always there for me, always providing a comforting shoulder. She was the one I relied the most on when I lost my powers, at least within the family. She had little spirit power, but in the end, she was completely amazing. Karen had dark hair, they were like light and day in all respects. She was brash and stubborn, a lot like me actually, probably because she looked up to me. She had a good amount of Reisu, it increased as she grew, and during the Second War, she didn't partake in battle but she helped to maintain defensive positions. Yuzu helped with healing when she could. Karen was always into sports, and I always tried to be there to support her games. I think I only missed a few, and each was Soul Society related. But she was excellent at them, probably could have been a professional. She actually dated a Shinigami, though their story is amusing. I have so many fond memories of them, their smiles, their laughter, the women they matured into. Yuzu would always nag me to get more sleep, or eat more. She was always worrying after everyone. Karen cared in that gruff kind of way, but underneath she was very much like Yuzu. We used to on the anniversary of our mother's death have a picnic at the cemetery. We would talk to her, tell her about our year, and just be together as a family. I used to walk them home from school when they were younger, ask them about their days, assist them if they needed help with homework. After Kaa-san died, one of my driving wills in life was protecting them. There were the nights before it all started, Goatface would come barreling in from the clinic, attempt to tackle me, where I would consequently subdue him, before sobbing at the large poster of Kaa-san. Yuzu would berate us both before ushering us to the dinner table with her mighty wooden spoon. Sometimes Karen would cheer, oftentimes she preferred to complain. And there was the good mixed in with the bad of the war. When Karen unlocked her Shinigami potential, I was the one to train her, teach her to manifest her Zanpakuto, help her to achieve Shikai. She was one of my fist students in that respect, and it was stunning to see the determination kindled on her features as she worked to deepen her powers. Yuzu had a bad breakup, and instead of going to her twin, or Goatface, she came to me. We devoured a tub of ice cream, and watched a couple comedies. We just shared in our laughter and the love we held for each other. We joked and laughed, gossiped about whatever curled up on the couch at home. The 3 of us would sometimes trip into the kitchen, though more commonly it was just Yuzu and I, pull out one of Kaa-san's old recipe books and just make it, fitting together seamlessly. Ichigo's eyes were suspiciously wet when he finished, though no tears fell. His throat was dry after having spoken for so long, and his emotions and insides felt as if they had been dumped into a tsunami of a storm with an umbrella and then dragged through a volcano. Talking about them hurt. Struck deep at his core, and brought forth a cascade of memories both painful and endearing. It was funny how easy it was to push it all aside for a time, the sadness and homesickness. But it was also infinitely more rewarding to think of them, remember their smiles, the color of their eyes. Which ice cream flavor was their favorite? It brought warmth and color into the everyday monochrome, soft pastels speaking of events past, and rich earthy colors harboring secrets and emotions, nurturing them. A mug of tea was passed to Ichigo, steam rising up in incandescent swirls. Ichigo nodded his head in thanks and took a slight sip. His breath was still ragged in his lungs, berating with the weight of his own memories. A warm hand settled on Ichigo's left shoulder and he looked up to catch Anohana's cold, dark, fathomless eyes. Her Reisu swirled around him, comforting and open in a sincerely sincere way. She stared at him before a smile settled on her lips, and in a soft, wistful way she said, "Your sisters sound like wonderful women, Ichigo. I would be happy if I ever have the chance to meet them." Ichigo nodded his agreement, a faded smile of pride and love lingering on his lips before he cast his gaze towards the tea below, and took another sip. Silence hovered for a moment, the two content to wait as Ichigo attempted to recuperate from the rush of emotions, and batter away the exhaustion that bordered his subconscious. Anohana was silent with contemplation. She frowned into her teacup before she asked, "Ichigo, do you want to talk about their passing? We don't have to if you're not ready." Ichigo looked up, startled at the rather unexpected question. There was no judgment on Anohana's features, only everlasting patience. He thought about her question. He didn't think he would ever fully be ready to talk about their deaths, much less anyone else. But did he want to? They had been a focal point of Ichigo's life for nearly all of it, however tragically short. That didn't deter the point that their deaths had damn well murdered Ichigo. But he had promised that he would remember them, and talk about Yuzu's cooking and Karen's sports. It was all well and good, but Ichigo knew the supposed bad had to be remembered always. For the sun could not be so radiant without the night. Talking about them would hurt, initially and probably for a while afterwards, but it would give him the chance to try and let it go, or at least condition himself to be able to speak about them without breaking down, however unlikely such a plan seemed. They survived the first war, but they didn't make it through the second, like everyone else. We set up a barrier between the human and Shinigami world, so that the Quincy kind couldn't invade and disrupt the human world. But Bach found a way to slip through, and he found my sisters, of all things. In a small show of mercy, he didn't torture them, didn't draw out their deaths. He had targeted my family because he knew it would affect me, but at that point in the war he had still cared for life. I found them. Ichigo's voice was a restless whisper, that drew to a simmering silence. His hands were clenched into the sheets, and his breath was ragged, escaping his lungs in harsh pants. He could feel his world closing in around him as the relentless sight of their corpses passed on the floor, arms entangled together, chased him, pulling at the healing threads of sanity of his mind. Seared into the back of his eyelids and confusing all his senses. Ichigo shuddered, hands twitching, and before it could develop any worse, before he could fall into unconsciousness, he felt Zanjitsu's Reisu surge over him, helping to drive away the lingering dread that pooled in his gut. The maelstrom of emotions that the mere thought of that event had wrought. Zanjitsu's Reisu wrapped up Ichigo in layers of bubble wrap and warmth, while Shiro plainly sealed the memories up into the back of his mind. Anohana's Reisu peaked, heavy and dark. Nothing of the cyanide lighting she usually carried, this was heady like the earth, or the air after rainfall as it wrapped around Ichigo, soothing his senses. The imposing woman swept forward, hesitating beside Ichigo. She sought his eyes. Gaining his sight, she slowly bent over till she was a breath away. Then she, in the ever-same excruciatingly slow manner, wrapped her arms around Ichigo. He flinched slightly as he was drawn into her chest, the contact sparking all kinds of warning bells, before they dispersed to nothing. Ichigo felt his erratic breathing start to fade as she continued to hug him, her presence and Zanjitsu's wrapped around Ichigo like a blanket. "Ichigo, remember, you have already changed the timelines, you're not going to lose anyone else." Anohana consoled in a whisper, before she slowly drew away. She paused, holding his shoulders at arm's length, her eyes bore into Ichigo as if scraping away at the surface to reveal the core of his being. Ichigo couldn't muster the energy to care, and instead yawned, blinking away the tired tilt to his eyes. "I'll let you get some rest, Ichigo, don't hesitate to call if you need anything. And I promise, next time it will be my turn to share a story." Anohana counseled with a faint smile, Her eyes were troubled and thoughtful, but Ichigo could see there was newfound awareness and contemplation thrown into the mix for fun. Nodding, Ichigo watched as the female captain swept from the room in a leisurely walk. Ichigo turned to consider the window once more, debating the merits of attempting to escape through the small frame again. Another yawn ragged his mouth as Ichigo slumped against the bed, everything feeling heavy in his tired state. Zanjitsu's presence rolled over Ichigo, assuring him, and gently lulling him to sleep. His last thoughts were of Yuzu and Karen's brilliant smiles. X. Chapter 33, Kintsukuroi. X. Ichigo basked in the sunlight from where he was settled on a long stone bench entrenched in the gardens of the forest. There was a pleasant breeze drifting through the air and the weather was pleasant. From underneath the hanging tendrils of a weeping willow, Ichigo peeked out at the rest of the garden, intimate with its design through his many escapes, but less so in the daylight. The young Shinigami was ecstatic to finally be released from his somewhat confining room in the forest. He wasn't claustrophobic by any means, but anyone could go crazy after spending more than a few days conscious in there. Anohana had quite firmly glared at him with all the presence of the terrifying woman she was, as she had conceded in allowing Ichigo outside, of course on some conditions. Ichigo didn't mind the Shinigami settled a good distance away knee-deep in a flower bed. The women had already been tending the garden, and had saved Ichigo the hassle of attempting to escape the severed gaze of a healer solely focused on their patient, which in that case would be Ichigo. Zanjitsu settled across Ichigo's lap, hummed with energy reflecting their wielder's content. Ichigo huffed a faint breathless laugh and shifted to run his hand over the blade. Speaking to Anohana the day before left Ichigo feeling tender and open, longing for solitude and time to collect his thoughts. He needed the time to think, to recover from speaking about everything, to just settle once more. But the inevitable crushing loneliness of the fourth had returned even with Hanatero's brief intermissions, so Ichigo had been pleasantly surprised to hear he would be receiving a visitor, and thankfully not some fan of the Shinigami Women Association's magazines. The excitement of having another visitor had quickly turned to equal parts hesitance when Anohana had revealed it was Byakuya who was finally coming to visit. Apparently the Kukaki heir had tried to visit before, but apparently Ichigo had been very much out of commission, and unaccepting of visitors in his unconscious state. His thoughts on Byakuya were a confusing mess of strings that he was still trying to untangle. Byakuya had, and would always first and foremost be Ichigo's best friend. He treasured that relationship and didn't want to lose it. He didn't need romance in his life, not at least with the state he was in. So he would wait, he wouldn't mention it, they could just act as they normally were. Or at least Ichigo hoped it could be so, though he acknowledged the latest incident might have unforeseen consequences with a furrowed brow. Ichigo also considered the other tremulous knots tangled up in his mind. There was the matter of the night Ichigo had succumbed to his exhaustion. Ichigo knew he was in for a verbal lashing, or something of the sort depending on the Kukaki's mood, in the near future for not trusting his friend, or confiding in him sooner. In Ichigo's defense, he still believed he had done the right thing in not disturbing Byakuya. As much as the Shinigami was likely guilting himself over the matter, he couldn't control Ichigo's actions, much less a delirious Ichigo. It was his choice to not disturb Byakuya while on his date, and he would stick by that when they finally confronted it. There was also the matter of Hisuna, her illness, and Rukia, which Ichigo was trying to sort through. He had a few ideas of what could be killing Hisuna, but without testing he couldn't be sure. Though Kisuke was a former spy, perhaps he would be able to aid Ichigo in his conquest. He wanted to try and save the kind woman if he could. The light in the Byakuya's eyes of his timeline when he spoke of her still lingered with Ichigo in a soft warmth spreading through his chest. Ichigo wanted Byakuya to have that happiness, and a relationship that would support him and help him grow. There was also Rukia. Ichigo knew that he was going to need a lot of preparation and probably a few more therapy sessions with Anohana before he would be able to face the midget. He was mostly certain that Rukia already existed within the timeline due to Hisuna's appearance, but he reminded himself to check. He had no idea how his time travel would affect future events, the so-called butterfly effect. In any case, Ichigo knew what district the small future Shinigami had grown up in. She had relayed her history a few times to Ichigo. Ichigo paused and cocked his head for a moment, a faint whisper of an idea settling into the creases of his mind. Even if he couldn't save Hisuna, and he would damn well try, he could still make sure she reunited with Rukia. After all, Ichigo knew where Hisuna's sister was, and it would be a way to thank both Rukia and Hisuna, while allowing them both the closure they needed. Just thinking of Rukia brought a soft and sad smile to Ichigo's lips, images of the fiery midget passing through his mind's eye. Seeing her, and the others in whatever plane he had transcended, had been hard enough on his emotional stability as it was. But Rukia was a blatant sign that the future was drawing closer in multiple ways. Ichigo had always had a few half-baked notions about how he would deal with certain incidents, or characters, but it wouldn't be such a simple thing to deal with. He would have to work around certain incidents, make sure others occurred. Like his Hine meeting Masaki, though it wasn't necessary he would like the two to meet each other in the future. Ichigo always remembered his parents' romance with a fond smile and a whistle of nostalgia. They had been utterly beautiful in their love, a balanced relationship, where neither had held more power. They had loved each other with all their hearts, and then their children as well. And Ichigo thought the two deserved that, if also so that Uriu's father could make his own choice as well. He had thought over it a bit, when he considered how messing with Aizen would affect the timeline. His conclusions had left a small frown on his lips, because if Aizen wasn't there to incur the power of the Espada and challenge Soul Society, they would lack the training and power needed to prepare for the Quincy that the Winter War had provided. Otherwise they would likely be obliterated even with extra training. He had been dwelling on the matter, trying to find a solution, a way to up the training of the whole Godi 13, but it was no small feat. In the end, he had dejectedly decided on consulting and confiding in Kisuke and Sosuke. The two masterminds would likely be able to help Ichigo come to a solution that had been staring him in the face the whole time, though he wasn't letting them plot out the whole future, as they inevitably would, given free range. Thinking of the future helped to draw Ichigo's mind back to the topic at hand, that being Byakuya and his fully warranted concerns, Shiro saying otherwise didn't count. Ichigo had told Kyan, he had told the Suteiko, he had hinted well enough to the science nut jobs, and he had finally talked to Anohana, but he hadn't disclosed his rather impressive time-traveling abilities to the Kukaki heir. Ichigo felt a touch of guilt at the matter. He had shared the rather life-changing information with near everyone but his best friend. Which was basically a breach of the friendship code, but Ichigo was willing to temporarily overlook that set of codes considering his less-than-stellar record. He was supposed to be able to trust Byakuya with anything. And he did. But Ichigo supposed he wasn't yet ready to share his complete life story with the man. Though Ichigo knew for certain that the truth would come to a head eventually. Things like time travel didn't stay secret forever no matter how much Ichigo could try. If he hadn't told the two science freaks they would have figured it out within a few months anyways. Telling them just gave him a portion of control over what they knew, in addition to a strict no experimenting rule. It still weighed on his heart that he should come clean to Byakuya. His friend deserved it for all he stuck by Ichigo for. The blade in his hands hummed and Asen's old voice drew along the channels of Ichigo's mind. All with time, Ichigo, the universe constructs opportunities when they are needed. You're not ready to face this truth in detailing it to Byakuya, so wait. At the very least till you are healed, and clear-minded. When Zanjitsu said it, it sounded 1,000 times easier, Ichigo thought with a huff and a fond smile. He could understand patience and practice it well enough, Ichigo supposed, having spent years dealing with his father after all. Yuzu had to have had the patience of a goddess with what she put up with. With a sigh, he ran a hand through his hair and Ichigo decided to put the matter to rest, choosing to dwell on it another day, among the hundreds of other threads, odds and ends, that formed his thoughts. The devil of his thoughts appeared with a shimmer of Reisu brushing against Ichigo's senses, jerking him from his quiet contemplation. Looking up semi-sharply, Ichigo caught the gleam of light off of Byakuya's Kensei-kin as the man hovered by the doorway to the gardens. Upon noticing Ichigo's gaze pinned to his form for a few minutes, hungrily drinking in the sight of his friend, Byakuya looked up. The Kukaki stepped out of the shade of the doorway and into the cool gardens, gliding across the soft emerald grass towards Ichigo. He looked the same as the last time Ichigo had seen him, all pressed elegance that was ice-sharp, but a slight bit ruffled. His hair was mussed, his hand clenched around the hilt of his Zanpakuto, and his eyes were a wicked storm beneath the crown of his hair. Byakuya paused before Ichigo, letting his deep silver eyes slide to lock onto Ichigo's amber orbs. They stayed there in the silence of the garden, broken only by the shuffle of the plant life and other living things, staring into each other's eyes, assessing, questioning, apologizing. Finally, with a battered sigh, Ichigo cracked a welcoming smile and gestured to the side where the rest of the bench stretched out. Some of the tension bundling in Byakuya's shoulders dissipated at the gesture, and the lieutenant of the 6th shook his head with exasperation before plopping down, lacking the agile finite grace of his station. "It's good to see you awake, Ichigo, and not through the trembling doorway of a private room," Byakuya commented lightly, as if talking about the weather, except for the small inflections in his words, his voice a completely normal mix of exasperated and fondness that only came from dealing with Ichigo's antics and tics for too long. Ichigo shrugged faintly before turning his attention to Byakuya. He nodded, and replied, "I missed you too. And it's nice to finally get some fresh air. Looking to escape again, are we?" Byakuya questioned with a feral grin that was all teeth. Ichigo smirked in response, settling into the familiar rhythm between the two, knowing that eventually it would have to be broken for more pressing matters. Ichigo winked and shot back, "You wish." Byakuya laughed silently under his breath, still the picture of perfect dignitary for all others to see. Gazing superstitiously around as if to spot eavesdroppers, Byakuya leaned in close as if to speak a secret before he said, "I'll help as long as we're not stuck in the woods for 2 days, again." Ichigo spluttered at the reminder of that particular event. A light embarrassed blush stained his cheeks as he craned his head back. Byakuya laughed outright at Ichigo's stunned expression, even as Ichigo hastily whispered, "We agreed we wouldn't speak of that, besides you were the one who agreed to come." Byakuya stilled in his laughter, and considered Ichigo and his words with a raised brow. Shaking his head, Ichigo slapped Byakuya lightly on the arm, receiving a barely there reprimanding glare in return for the action. The Kukakier huffed at Ichigo's nonchalant response, pretending to turn away and give him the cold shoulder. The action lasted for all of a few seconds before Byakuya turned around, eyes open and dark. Before Ichigo was aware he was doing it, he clasped his hand lightly over Byakuya's arm, giving it a light squeeze in a sign of reassurance. Byakuya let out a heavy breath of air and considered Ichigo for a few moments before saying within a soft and breathy voice, with some hidden urgency, "Kami, Ichigo, I was so worried. I didn't know what was happening. Suddenly you were in the 4th and nobody could see you. I was so scared I was going to lose my best friend." Even as Byakuya's facial features remained relatively impassive with his words, his voice shook and trembled with tender emotions, and his eyes were a sandstorm that swept Ichigo off his feet and stole his breath. He knew his injury, read carelessness, had hurt the people around him, but he hadn't realized it had struck Byakuya so deeply, nor had he yet experienced its devastation firsthand. Furrowing his brow, Ichigo considered Byakuya, noting the downturned eyes and closed body language. Zanjitsu hummed where he set it gently beside him on the bench as he reached over to grasp Byakuya's hands. The familiar callus of sword play sounding across his hands, and long spindly fingers. "I'm sorry, Bya. It's okay, I'm here, and I'm not going to be leaving anytime soon, not if Anohana has anything to say about it," Ichigo said, voice soft and meaningful, before picking up with a happy and playful grin at the end. Byakuya laughed, looking up from where his gaze had been drawn to their hands, the sorrow that had hovered like a cloud disappearing into a more somber and contemplative air. His eyes were bright once more, and he stared at Ichigo, till the orange-haired Shinigami felt a touch uncomfortable under the force of his gaze. Then a wicked twist took Byakuya's face, and Ichigo could only gulp in preparation for well-deserved repatriation. "Ichigo Shiba, you are a foolish man, you know that." Ichigo nodded in a complacent manner, at the sharp sarcastic tones, and Byakuya continued with a faint growl, "I mean, are you kidding me? You don't sleep well for who knows how many days, and then you decide it's a good idea to go on a walk without telling anyone, and get yourself blown to the 7th layer of sleep." Byakuya beneath the calm and polite exterior had words of venom that splattered against his soul, and made Ichigo hiss at the harsh truth his friend was spouting. As if sensing Ichigo's dejectedness, Byakuya's eyes simmered from their molten silver, and in a softer voice he continued, "Ichigo, I know you are not always used to depending on people. But even if I'm busy, you can always call on me. I'll drop everything to help you. Just as I know you'll do the same." Ichigo dropped his own gaze, hands tightly clenched together as Byakuya's words rebounded throughout his skull. Ichigo sighed softly, turning his gaze away from his friend to study the sprawling vista of greenery. "Byakuya, I made a mistake. I stopped caring about what would happen to my body. But I don't regret not coming to you that night." Ichigo turned to pin Byakuya with a glare when the lieutenant made to protest. "I know you will drop anything for me, and I would do the same for you, but that doesn't make it your fault. Because I was the one who chose to move on, it was my choice, you couldn't have stopped it if you tried. I know I screwed up Byakuya, but I'm going to try and start healing. Anohana's been helping me a bit. I want to get better, and I know that you'll be there to support me. Ichigo's thought process was a jumbled mess, and what he was trying to say came out disjointed and slow, some of the meaning behind his words shining through regardless. Byakuya turned to consider Ichigo, a frown marring his brow as he pieced together the orange-haired Shinigami's words. Before Ichigo could shift out of the way, he was drawn into a sudden side hug, pressed up against Byakuya. Fond eyes were centered on Ichigo and he shifted till he felt comfortable before flashing the air a mirroring expression. We're a right mess, aren't we? Ichigo suggested with a huff followed by a weak laugh. Byakuya laughed alongside Ichigo for a minute considering his friend before replying, most certainly, but any other way and we wouldn't be half as amazing as we are now. Laughter rippled out into the open, at Byakuya's nonchalant phrasing as the two giggled, as if the funniest joke in the world had been shared between the two. Eventually regaining himself, Ichigo panted, giggles still slipping past his lips. His eyes found Byakuya's and before they could help it they were laughing once more, doubled over the bench with his stomach aching. So, I saw you were with a girl that night. Ichigo ventured with a sly wink once they had settled themselves once more. Byakuya flinched, sending a sharp suspicious glare at Ichigo from beneath the shadows of the foliage. The Kukaki sighed, tapping his fingers against his thigh as if contemplating answering Ichigo, before he looked at the orange-haired nuisance and with an amused shake said, "Yes, I was with a girl, her name is Hisuna. I think you might remember meeting her in the marketplace that one time. Ah yes, the fate-driven collision, you were instantly pinning, and I assured you that life would bring you two together." Ichigo, already well knowing the answer, responded sardonically with a wiggle of his eyebrows and a suggestive wink. Byakuya blushed faintly, eyes hard as diamonds as he stared at the orange-haired Shinigami, before with a dramatic sigh the man responded indignantly, "I was not pining." Ichigo made a vague sound of obvious sarcasm and said, "Of course not," before he seceded and slumped against the bench. Perking up slightly at a sudden thought, Ichigo flashed a wicked grin and asked, "So a second date?" Byakuya glared and huffed a bit, like a horse biting at the champ, before he rolled his eyes with thinly veiled amusement and annoyance only a best friend could muster before he replied a touch reluctantly, "Yes, there's a second date. Look at Byakuya all grown up," Ichigo declared with false exuberance, pretending to wipe away fake tears, and Kami he was starting to sound like his father. Byakuya rolled his eyes once more, reaching up to flick Ichigo on the shoulder before he settled down once more. Ichigo batted at the hand, till he was left in peace where he promptly slouched once more. He still felt worn, and would likely feel like that for some time to come according to Anohana, and while the fresh air was nice Ichigo already felt a touch tired. Still he could go on for quite a while, if it was Byakuya he was there to keep him awake. "So, what's the recovery plan?" Byakuya asked pleasantly, curiosity lining his brow. Ichigo shrugged vaguely, a touch of discomfort splashing his features before he replied, "Anohana wants me to start on sleep aid pills, and then work on better eating habits, plus some therapy." Byakuya turned concerned eyes Ichigo's way, studying the orange-haired Shinigami as if asking himself a question regarding Ichigo's listed health recovery. As the remaining silence took hold, Ichigo ran a hand through his hair, and with all the petulance he could manage continued, "And she's planning on making me eat with either the clan, or Teiko." Byakuya's gaze was heavily amused as it swerved and landed on Ichigo, wry chuckles escaping his lips he responded, "Ah yes, the horror of having to eat with people. It must have been a pain eating lunch with me every day at the academy." Ichigo spluttered at Byakuya's sharp retort, a frown crossing his features. Ichigo huffed and shot back, "That was different, there was no one else around. Plus, you can actually hold a decent conversation. Unlike Teiko most of the time, sometimes he has nothing to talk about but how Jushiro should totally assist him with his next prank, or he's mooning about the man." Byakuya laughed heartily at Ichigo's whining tones, a disbelieving stare leveled at him from under Byakuya's brows. Ichigo pouted but dropped the act with heavy sigh, letting his body slump to rest against Byakuya. He'd been feeling clingy since he had woken up. As if the deep-rooted fear of losing everyone having been brought to the surface of his psyche had encouraged such a reaction. "It sounds like you're in good hand with Anohana's plan," Byakuya suggested calmly, a sly grace of his lips giving away the game. Ichigo chose not to rise to the bait and nodded, fingering Zanjutsu's hilt as his eyes swept over the garden once more, noting the locations of the other Shinigami present. "Hey Bya?" Ichigo questioned faintly in the open air, eyes soft and nostalgic as he soaked in the atmosphere and his friend's presence. Byakuya cocked his head, ebony tresses swaying with the motion. He gestured for Ichigo to continue. "Remember that time we got lost in the woods?" Ichigo relayed with a bemused smile. Byakuya frowned for a minute before his eyes widened. He groaned, and responded, "As I seem to recall, it was you who got us lost in the first place." Ichigo plastered on an innocent expression, hands splayed against his chest in pseudo-horror at such an accusation. Byakuya stared unamused for a moment before shaking head at Ichigo's familiar actions. "It was not my fault, I was just temporarily directionally challenged. In any case, remember how it rained like the gods themselves were angry." Ichigo parried with an east gate. Byakuya's gaze settled on Ichigo and contained a bare shred of amusement laying under the bare disbelief at Ichigo's defense. Ichigo chuckled quietly at the expression. It was always fun to rile up the other lieutenant and see how long he could hold his mask. There was always the additional bonus of when Byakuya said his name with a long-suffering sigh, that spelled all the woe in the world in a single word. "I remember, we were there for 3 days, right, and every day it rained without fail." Byakuya retorted with a heavy staleness and dry amusement, thinking of their circumstances. Ichigo shrugged his shoulders, the vague chill of wet heavy cloth washing over him before disappearing in the mid-afternoon sunlight. Those days had been long and relatively miserable, but the situation had been lightened by Byakuya's companionship, and the fire they had eventually lit even with the rain. "And then we stumble onto a village, soaked to the bone," Ichigo said with a half-smile. Byakuya turned and pinned Ichigo with his heavy lead eyes and continued the story, and then Jinrei appeared, and was, well, angry is one way to put it. "Oh yeah, he chewed us out halfway to hell. But it was worth it in the end," Ichigo added, fondly recalling the series of events with a smile. The wind rustled past the two, cajoling hair into a reckless dance. Ichigo shared a faint smile with Byakuya before his gaze distantly landed on the garden. "Once you are free of Anohana's torturous clutch, we should go out for tea, catch up. You can tell me how the training went." Byakuya's tenor drifted between the two, and Ichigo looked up at the words spoken tenderly with spitfire snark and suggestion. Ichigo nodded, flashing a bare wink in Byakuya's direction before he replied, "Indeed, wouldn't want to miss out on our annual tea sessions. And you can tell me all the latest juicy gossip." Byakuya let out a deep laugh, the sound vibrating throughout the small area. He turned amused eyes in Ichigo's direction and combated with, "I thought gossip was Kaien's duty." Ichigo frowned before nodding sagely, conceding Byakuya's point with slip of a grin. A tender silence stretched between the two, and Ichigo was content to bask in it, worrying his lip as he thought over rampant suggestions and ideas, pushing back faint nostalgia and lingering emotions. "Missed you," Ichigo said, soft as the breeze in the small garden. Byakuya turned to consider Ichigo, eyes warm as a hearth. He replied, "Missed you too." Ichigo leaned into Byakuya's side, fingering the hilt of his Zanpakuto as he dwelled faintly on those words, like the choir of church bells inside his head. The faint nostalgia sticking the back of his throat as silence continued to reign undisturbed. Kaien slouched in the chair, brushing a hand through his hair, as he sipped from a mug firmly clenched in his other hand. Ichigo thought his brother looked tired and worn still, but he wasn't as bad as that first night. When Ichigo had finally awoken, it had been to the visibly haggard appearance of the Shiba heir. Kaien had proceeded to talk, cry, and yell at Ichigo for the next 5 minutes before he had realized Ichigo was far too out of it to understand a word he had sprouted. In the end, they had settled in the silence, Kaien speaking in soft, gentle tones of little everyday things, like the one shoji door that always squeaked, or Ganju's latest escapades with Enrungokai. He had spoken soft and snuck glances at Ichigo at every possible interval, as if afraid that if he didn't, Ichigo would slip away. It had settled Ichigo, and before he had realized it, he had drifted to sleep once more in his brother's presence. Now Kaien was here again in the late evening, after finally escaping work. At least that was the tale Kaien spun. In all reality, Yukatake likely let him go early. The Shiba heir looked up suddenly, as if feeling Ichigo's studying gaze, and flashed his younger brother a reassuring smile and said, "Don't worry about me, Ichi, I'm getting sleep now that I know you'll be okay." There was the confirmation to Ichigo's suspicions that the worried older brother hadn't slept. What else could Ichigo expect of Kaien, other than to comfort his younger brother, when it was obvious the older had something weighing on his chest. Ichigo nodded and flashed a wicked smile and snapped back, "Course I worry about you, Kion, especially after that one time with the apples." Ichigo let his sentence die off at Kion's sudden glare peeking out from beneath the crown of his bangs. The glare disappeared quickly enough with a shake of Kion's head and a small puff of laughter. The man settled once more into the seat. "How are you feeling, Ichigo?" Kion questioned, concern lining his voice, and furrowing his brow. Ichigo shrugged a touch, thinking over the question. He was tired, that much was clear, at least with the drowsiness that clung to his movement, and the cobwebs lining his head. But he didn't feel particularly overwhelmed by any certain emotion. He felt lighter after having chatted with Byakuya, in addition to Anohana, so as a whole, he felt lighter, the tensions and worry over the situation that had arisen gone in the face of their chat. Tired, but a lot better at the moment. Ichigo answered with a wry smile that belied some of the emotions coalescing in amber orbs. Kion frowned a touch, lips curving down slightly, but otherwise said nothing, nodded with a sad sort of twist. Ichigo wondered how his brother was handling everything. Kion had been the one to which Ichigo had revealed everything, albeit in a disjointed and pull-apart way. He had been the one to see Ichigo struck up by madness and totally lost, depthless and drowning. He wondered if the older brother was okay. They had hardly had the chance to see each other since Ichigo had woken up a few days before. He had dumped a heap of information on Kion, mentioned his death and how fucked up the future was, a future that was Ichigo's life. So Ichigo fully expected a likely confrontation of his declaration of time travel among other things. Kion shifted, drawing Ichigo's attention, as the lieutenant shuffled through a stack of papers precariously balanced on his lap, as he rubbed at his forehead. Sometimes it was easy for Ichigo to forget how much work his brother did. The man was not only the heir of the Shiba clan, but also a lieutenant for the Godi 13. And yet he managed to present all the energy and mannerisms of a child, albeit in a tamer way than as Hein. Ichigo doubted anyone could muster the sheer enthusiasm for life as Hein held. Which reminded Ichigo that as Hein would likely be visiting soon. As the clan head, it was his duty to check on an injured clan member. Though Ichigo didn't doubt he would do it in any case, as that was the kind of man as Hein was. Even for all his dramatics, the values he held for family were high, though perhaps not solid, more of a linear value. He vaguely wondered, with a touch of amusement and humor, if Anohana would recognize the man as his future father. Well, Ichigo had never confirmed to the women that his father was a captain. Ichigo didn't doubt her intelligence and her ability to piece the clues together. After all, Ichigo was obviously of Shiba lineage. His face mirroring Kion's couldn't be chalked up to coincidence. And with the power level he had revealed he possessed, well, it would be obvious he wasn't the son of some background Shinigami. Ichigo was already quite certain that the Suteiko knew which one of the captains would become the deserter, but the old man likely didn't care, or just wanted to see the drama unfold. In any case, Ichigo would still have to face the energetic man soon enough, and that was as always a mixed cocktail of emotions. Ichi. Kion's even timbre pierced the silence along with the shuffle of paper. Ichigo looked up at the fond nickname Kion often rolled out, along with a few other variations that often included the use of strawberry. Ichigo responded to the silent inquisition demurely with a faint, Kion twitched a bit, hands twisting together, before the man looked up, powerful silver eyes studying Ichigo. Having found his resolution, Kion sighed and hesitantly questioned, "Ichigo, is it okay to ask you about that night, and what you revealed?" And there was what Ichigo had been bracing himself for the moment Kion sauntered through the door with pep and a shallow smirk. A warmth settled in Ichigo's chest that Kion had thought to ask Ichigo if it was okay, instead of firing away. Ichigo had never really understood or appreciated having an older sibling till Kion had squashed his way into every inch of Ichigo's life. In his original timeline, the other Shinigami had certainly cared for Ichigo like a younger sibling, if only because he was most certainly one by 100 years, but they had been friends or mentors first and foremost. It had been a strange experience adapting to the concern for his health and safety that Kion mustered at every opportunity. The respect of his boundaries, and sometimes just knowing what exactly Ichigo needed to hear or talk about. It was overwhelming and endearing in a way only the Shiba clan could muster. Their welcoming attitudes had pulled him into their folds, no matter how reluctantly he had resisted. Their chats over sake had been bonding time exclusively for the two of them. A chance to get to know each other, and for Ichigo it really was like meeting a stranger. He had heard stories of course, both from Yukatake and Rukia, but meeting Kyan in real life had been a different experience. He had learned that the man preferred sake from a small store sequestered in Rungokai, that he originally hadn't known what he wanted to do with his life, until he met Yukatake, that the water had always soothed him and he had always connected with it. The love that Kyan simply radiated for his family, couldn't be related in words. Ichigo was glad Kyan had convinced him to accept the adoption into the Shiba clan. He didn't know how he would have survived without his older brother's constant support. Without the support of the clan, they along with Byakuya had pulled him out of his shell, and helped him focus on the present and actually living. Ichigo considered the question Kyan had posed. While that night was still tender in his mind, it wasn't an open wound. He had accepted it for what it was, shouldering the grief and guilt it had unleashed, but with the barest whisperings as if grains of sand piled upon his shoulders. In any case Kyan deserved the truth, and the answers to the multitude of questions Ichigo had no doubt left the Shiba air with. Zanjitsu hummed reassurance along their bond, their presence sharper in his mind than it had been for a while, without him realizing it. They had admitted the faults on either side, and realized pent-up words and emotions had been clogging their bond for a while, slowly building up to a heaving mess, like Ichigo's breakdown. Yeah, you can ask Kyan. You deserve the truth. Ichigo replied, lifting Kyan's attention from where it had idly plummeted towards the paperwork once more. The older brother's silver eyes positively glowed at Ichigo's answer and he felt a mirroring smile settle on his own lips. Then Kyan paused, eyes scrutinizing Ichigo's features. He deflated slightly and said, "Don't do it because you think I deserve the truth. As much as my curiosity is nipping at my bones. Are you okay to talk about it?" Ichigo smiled softly and nodded in acknowledgement, warmth flooding his chest at Kyan's concern. The man smiled then, shoulders relieved from their tense slump. He took a breath, eyes staring out into the silence before he continued in an awkward, hesitant tone, "So the future?" Ichigo nodded with a huff of laughter, and ran a hand through his hair. Turning his gaze to the sheets he nodded and replied, "Yeah, the future." How far into the future?" Kyan asked after a few minutes of silence, after the confirmation had set in. Ichigo considered the question, pursing his lips and furrowing his brow in thought. Zanjitsu helpfully, not so much in Shiro's case, attempted to aid Ichigo, helping him line out the timeline and what had occurred, and what was yet to occur. "I would say about 60 to 70 years' time in the mortal realm, but it's hard to put an exact number." Kyan flinched at the answer, eyes wide as saucers. He mumbled out, "That close?" Ichigo nodded, bangs flopping forward to shade his eyes as he grasped the pommel of his Zanpakuto. Kyan bit his lip from the corner of Ichigo's peripheral view, the lieutenant's own hand resting on Nejibana's sea-wrapped hilt. "And you've here been since that night, what, over 100 years ago? Planning, trying to save the future?" Ichigo nodded, not exactly sure of the date he had arrived. Time always seemed to blow by before he had realized it, but the time frame sounded correct. Time in Soul Society was a misogynist concept, hard to navigate or circumvent. Time in the human world didn't always correspond exactly as it was supposed to either. Usually it was the fault of the Danga precipice, but Ichigo was pretty sure his little escapade in ripping apart time and space had messed with the space-time continuum in small unforeseen ways. Kyan thought on Ichigo's answer in the quiet that had descended between the two. Ichigo reached over and snatched one of the mugs of tea set out. The night had begun to chill with early dustings of the next season, and the stone bench was perhaps not the most comfortable perch to spend 3 hours on. It was a warm chai, spicy and sending heat corralling through his system. He drank the liquid slowly, content to savor the moment, and waste all the time Kyan needed to process the rather astatine information. "And I died?" Kyan questioned like the strike of a gong. Ichigo hesitantly nodded a sharp and stiff moment. He thumbed the mug in his hand, darting a glance at Kyan, catching a snapshot of the emotions sprawling across his features: sadness, contemplative thoughtfulness, curiosity, hesitance. Ichigo frowned, emotion caught in the threads of his reisu, as he sounded out, "It was close to when the whole thing began. A Shinigami you were quite close to was sent to the mortal world after the incident. Was Miyako okay? And the clan?" Kyan asked, a touch frantic brow furrowing with worry and concern. Ichigo knew the woman was his wife in the future, but as far as Ichigo was concerned, and knew, they had met in the 13th Division, as well as one of the recent festivals, and had only begun dating. Perhaps it was deeper than Ichigo thought. It was also completely expected of Kyan to ask after the clan, and the truth of the matter curled Ichigo's insides. Ichigo bit his lip at the answer, knowing it would hurt Kyan, just as likely as everything else Ichigo would relay to the Shiba heir. His voice was solemn as he uttered his next few words: "She died before you, killed by the same monster, a hollow of a certain megalomaniac's creation. Her death caused you to be careless and—" Ichigo trailed off, breath catching his lungs and forbidding him to speak of the incident any further. The Kyan of his timeline had always been a distant concept, someone Ichigo wished he could have known, but he had accepted he would be unable to. This Kyan was real and in front of him, a living, breathing person he knew as well as his features in the mirror. "And the clan?" Kyan asked, voice thick with sorrow and grief, his expression hidden under a perpetual cover of shade. Ichigo's head sunk towards the ground and he frowned before continuing. "They were disillusioned, struck from the rank of nobility upon false accusations. They were hunted down, and spread far and wide. In my timeline, I only met Kukeku and Ganju." The thought now of the clan, his clan terminated in such a way, bit at his nerves, and had him grasping Zanjitsu's blade. In his own timeline, he had never known them, they were a family he had never gotten to meet. And when Kukeku spoke of them, it was short with pain, and never close to the real things. The immense family the Shiba clan possessed had stunned and overwhelmed Ichigo at first, but he had gotten used to the prevailing warmth eventually. To relate it all to his living and breathing brother was a touch difficult. Kyan breathed in sharply, eyes wide as the moon. His Reisu was shaky around him, and Ichigo wished he could pull the lieutenant into a hug. But he didn't, knowing for once Kyan needed the space, needed to come to terms and grieve for a future he would never know. If Ichigo held even a fraction of his powers, it would be a future that would never come to pass. "So, I had an apprentice?" Kyan asked softly after the long period of silence had settled over them like a blanket, a little smothering but mostly just there. Ichigo nodded, a wistful smile lighting his lips as he thought of the tiny midget, and replied, "Yeah, she was the one to begin the first stepping stone to the whole catastrophe that was my life." Kyan flinched at the dry, amused tone competing with the faint snatches of blatant weary of the situation, in the one simple sentence. Kyan glanced up quickly, shifting his hands over and over again before he shook his head as if dismissing an idea. Finally, after a minute, Kyan cracked a half-smile studying Ichigo. He commented, "You've told me a bit about your family, are you actually related to the Shiba clan?" Ichigo pursed his lips at the question and crinkled his eyes at the light-suggesting tones underneath Kyan's simple question. He had talked about the girls and his parents briefly, some things more than others. "My father was of the Shiba clan. He deserted on a mission where he met my mother. My sisters and I were raised within the human realm, and knew nothing of our heritage." Kyan let a pleased smirk slip onto his lips at the confirmation and silently exclaimed, "I knew it, told Kukeku you had to be a Shiba with your facial features." The smile diminished somewhat as he acknowledged the next part of Ichigo's sentence and what it signified. Ichigo could almost see the man trying to piece the few pieces of the puzzle together, a thoughtful frown playing across his lips. Ichigo decided to aid his brother, and with a run through his bright hair, and a tick of Zanjitsu's presence, Ichigo continued, "I was dragged into the world of the Shinigami when I was 15. A Shinigami lent me her powers so I could save my family. She was taken back to Soul Society for breaking a law, though she was sentenced to execution, instead of the usual penalty. A few friends and I broke into Soul Society to rescue her. We succeeded, but in the end the true mastermind of the whole plan was revealed. A captain who was promoted to such a placement after the drastic drop in captains regarding the hollowification incident within my timeline. He fled to Hueco Mundo, where he raised an army of hollows equivalent in power to the Shinigami captains. The war lasted 3 years and was coined the Winter War, though no one can really say why, considering it wasn't even winter most of the time. There were battles and deaths, but most of Soul Society survived. Then came the resurgence of the 1,000-year Blood War. The long-fabled war between the Quincy and the Shinigami to seek balance. That war decimated both sides utterly, till I was the only one left standing. I couldn't let the future be what it had become, so I ripped apart time and space to travel back in time." Ichigo acknowledged that he was getting better at summarizing his life story, as he sipped at the soothing tea. He had given Kyan the bare bones, as he knew in the future he would be able to share information and stories freely, and it would likely be asked of him. For now, he could wait, until he had the energy and time, as well as the stability to speak of such things. You went into a war when you were 15? And fought in 2 wars? Kyan asked, voice shaky as his visage. His skin was pale, eyes wide, and the grip on his zanpakta was so tight the fingers around the metal were white. Ichigo breathed deeply and nodded. The semi-devastating fact had been brought up a few times, and more recently in the past few days. Ichigo ran a hand through his hair, and replied with the same answer he had given Anohana. If I hadn't fought, we would have likely lost. And in the end, if I hadn't fought, the human world would have eventually come under attack in any case. Kyan blanched, eyes hard and face grim at Ichigo's words. He softly growled out, and the Suteiko or the senior captains couldn't deal with the issue. Instead they forced a 15-year-old to fight their battles. Ichigo flinched again, hard hammering in his chest like a drum. His grip on Zanjutsu was iron-tight. Kyan's expression abruptly cleared at the tense figure Ichigo cast, brotherly worry taking over the malice that had quickly castrated his features. Every order has their faults, was the only justification Ichigo mustered. He had realized fairly early in the war, that Soul Society wasn't as clean as the ivory exterior liked to present. The history with the first substitute Shinigami, the Mod Souls. Soul Society had its own fair share of violence and dark history. It was in their very beginnings. But Ichigo had accepted it for what it was. In the end, when you're in a war fighting to save everything, those things matter less and you only focus on surviving and winning. Ichigo had been bitter about it a few times, stewed in anger and silence. The worst had been the period without his powers, left alone with only his thoughts, able to analyze the situation for what it had been. At the end of the war he couldn't muster the care or grudges, not for long dead souls. It was just the same in the new timeline, they were still mostly innocent of the future deeds. When he felt that anger he stowed himself away, whipped out Zanjutsu and let the injustices of the world rip from his blade. Ichigo yawned, the gesture ripping itself from his mouth. Kyan looked up at the movement, eyes warm and clashing with tepid ice. The older brother studied Ichigo for a moment, eyes sharp as daggers. He asked, was there any happiness in the wars? Ichigo considered the question, gentle nostalgia prodding his mind. He reached up and rubbed his arms, gaze drifting to the window. There had been good, the bad had been overwhelming, but there had been some sparks of good. Nights at the local bars, tipping back sake and swapping stories, tea under the beguiling sun, training, feeling the lust for battle in a friendly environment. The endless nights camped on Hueco Mundo's sands with Orium's strange cocktail of food-like substances. The Vizard moving as one cohesive unit, fighting together in a way that just couldn't be replicated. There was happiness, friends, family, and fond memories. The corners of Kyan's lips twitched up at the small confirmation, as if he couldn't bear the thought of Ichigo living such a life of darkness. He remembered when he had truly been a radiant soul, even underneath the layers of a tough exterior. A yawn slit Kyan's own features, and he sent a lukewarm glare in Ichigo's direction. The orange-haired Shinigami only grinned and waved with a humorous aura. Ichigo distractedly rubbed at his eyes. They were feeling heavy with the calling weight of sleep. He felt worn out from the day's events, and was already ready for sleep. Kyan lurched to his feet after carefully setting the paperwork down. He staggered over. In a soft, airy voice Kyan consoled, "We can talk more later. For now, why don't you get some sleep, Ichiberry? Ganja wants to cook a full-blown meal when we get home, and Kukeika wants to show off her new fireworks." Ichigo nodded, catching Kyan's outstretched hand and giving it a small squeeze of reassurance. Kyan laughed lightly and hopped over to plant a gentle kiss on Ichigo's forehead with a whispered, "Night." "Night, K." Ichigo responded sleepily, settling into the pillows, as the true weight of his tiredness made itself apparent. Kyan's lips curved into a gentle wistful smile, and he ruffled Ichigo's bright tangerine strands before pivoting and striding towards the door. A warmth settled in Ichigo's chest as he replayed the elder Shiba's words repeatedly within his mind. Zanjutsu hummed along his thoughts and throughout his chest, and with a few deep breaths Ichigo let the sleep clawing at his mind overtake him. X. Chapter 34, Redomancy. X. Jushiro shifted in the rather uncomfortable visitor chairs of the fourth that Retsu had never bothered to replace, even with all of Shunsui's complaining and whining, which Jushiro bore the brunt of more often than not. The fourth was quiet in the early morning, rebounded with a silence that just felt peaceful, but whispered otherwise of its patience. As was most of Seoul society, but then that was why they had chosen to visit at such a time. Without thinking of the action, Jushiro's gaze drifted over to his partner slouched in the seat, in an angle that suggested sleep, but was more of Shunsui's contemplative position. Or at least it could be, Ju acknowledged with a contrite smile. His curly hair was bunched along his shoulders in a messy tail, and his well-loved straw hat was eschewed upon his head. The cute sight brought a smile to the white-haired captain's features. Fabric shuffled softly in the background, and Jushiro's gaze was drawn to the resting orange-haired Shinigami they had come to visit. Ichigo was crashed in the medical gurney, sleep casting a relatively peaceful expression upon his young features, though it was broken every so often by a grimace and trace of pain. Jushiro wished he could aid the youth in some way, stop whatever nightmares that plagued him. It was those that had caused the stay in the fourth in the first place, and seeing the pain on a Shinigami he had come to consider a friend, if not something closer to family, cast bitterly inside himself, knowing he was powerless in most senses to aid Ichigo. The youth was still pale, but the dark purple that had rimmed his eyes like crescents was gone, and his presence was brighter, warmer in an indomitable sense, and that comforted Jushiro somewhat. The Shiba lieutenant of the 8th would probably be ecstatic to hear that today would be his last day in the 4th. He could finally go home, and as Jushiro suspected escape from the cramped building, though it was plausible Ichigo had already escaped, as had been the case before. They had stopped in for tea with Retsu before entering the room of one of her more vexing patients, and received the positive news cozied up in her office on the chairs embowed low to the ground, and with the consistency of quicksand. She had related the basics, patient confidentiality and all that, and it had been positive, which had brightened Yukate's considerably normal morning. It was always a pleasure to talk to Retsu. She was one of the few Shinigami actually older than them, which was sometimes a daunting thought, if a twist nostalgic. She was an intelligent woman, with a talent in healing that was unrivaled. Kind where it counted, displaying it to those who needed, all the while remaining firm. The mothering tendency she always held for her patients had become pronounced over the years, especially in cases with a long-term patient. With Jushiro's many visits to the 4th they had become well acquainted with the strict female captain. Even if Shunsui often balked at the thought of visiting the 4th, though it was always less so when it came to visiting someone important, they both knew they had a sort of home with the women. She always welcomed them with that small keen smile, offered tea, and was always there to talk. Shu sometimes referred to her as an estranged aunt with good intentions. A calloused and large hand grasped his own where it was settled on the chair, and Jushiro glanced over to look at his partner. Shunsui had been struck hard by Ichigo's collapse, and the awful surge of Reisu that had erupted that night, had coiled his instincts in warning, and echoing dredges of pain and fear, overshadowed by paternal worry. It wasn't easy, not when the threat of losing both of one's lieutenants, even if the prospect was quickly rectified, and then having it happen again so soon. Shunsui had spent more than a few days curled up in the 13th, hiding from the world, and the reality of the situations, for a slight change. Usually it was Jushiro seeking comfort from the curly-haired captain after an attack, or whatever other matter stirred him. Shunsui did seek comfort from Jushiro, though it was usually in a far different manner. Kairaku had a habit of internalizing whatever was troubling him. He would often bluster into the office after one of his attacks, and hide the distress beneath the cocky teasing and a bottle of sake. To see Shunsui shaking slightly, that distant gaze in his eyes that hadn't appeared since those first missions where reality had struck like a fist to the gut, worried Ju. But Jushiro had known Shunsui for many years, sometimes seemingly too many to count, and had easily calmed the captain of the 8th with soothing words, a calming tea, and the simple chatter about whatever Shunsui wanted. His partner had eventually pulled himself out of whatever slump he had drowned himself in, and they had talked, Shunsui brandishing his sake cup with an easy smile. Sogyo no Kotori giggled in his mind at the memories of a few of those events, the twin spirits always amused by whatever Jushiro's partner did, and a humorous smile settled on the white-haired captain's lips. What he wouldn't give to slip back into their days of the academy, if only for a short while, escape their current reality and all its grievances, the weight of their age. Time seemed simpler then, less troubled youth, and whispers of war in the air. It had been the academy, running around and trying to survive the workload, dealing with Shunsui's pranks, the Suteiko gruffly teaching them and taking them under his wing. Ju, you're doing it again. Shunsui's deep rumbling timbre, one that Ju felt he could listen to forever, scolded in a faint whisper, eyes straying to the still slumbering youth. Jushiro flashed an apologetic smile at Shunsui, vaguely shrugging his shoulders. The weight of the future had been heavy in his thoughts recently, and while dwelling and pondering was something Shu and himself had adopted in abundance, Yamjiai said it came with the age, which was not reassuring in the slightest. They both had agreed they would try not to dwell on the future. But well, the past was always open for nostalgia. Shunsui shook his head with a small half-laugh, curls of chocolate brown hair trailing out from under his hat to collect around his features. Those entrancing brown eyes locked onto Jushiro's own blue, the bond they shared that thrummed invisibly seemed to glow with happiness if just a touch briefly. A soft gurgle of noise drew them away from the staring that could go on for hours, content to just glimpse the universe in each other's eyes. Ichigo was stretching slightly in the bed, blinking blearily at the world, and rubbing at his eyes like a young child might. Jushiro thought the action was adorable, but wisely refrained from commenting on such. At least when the youth was waking up. Ichigo was not normally a morning person, though he did share a look with his partner and a raised brow. Shunsui only nodded his agreement with a smile covered behind his hand and bright fond warmth saturating his eyes. Ichigo's Reisu uncoiled from his form sentient-like, snaking across the room, till it landed on them. It paused, almost in confusion, then reached out to interact with their own presences more thoroughly. The orange-haired Shinigami's Reisu was raging fire in the form of determination, soft currents of tempered wisdom and grief, protective darkness like rich soils, to Jushiro's playful and hydraulic-natured Reisu. Ichigo's eyes fluttered open, revealing deep amber orbs, that swept around the room lazily tracing over their forms. The lieutenant's brow furrowed as his gaze landed on the two captains settled in the chairs once more, and a look of slight warmth with a touch of puzzlement spread over his gaze. He had the look of a man who desperately needed caffeine, and knowing Ichigo most assuredly in the form of tea. "Good morning, Ichigo." Shunsui spoke slowly and soothingly, the dazed just waking up expression still firmly entrenched on Ichigo's features. He blinked a few more times and then hesitantly raised his hand in a mute wave. After a quiet moment Ichigo made a soft sound and ran a hand through shocking orange hair, and in a voice slightly rough with disuse and the early hour responded, "Morning." Yukatake chuckled faintly under his breath at the finitely concerned and lost answer. He made a mental note that if there ever was time to question Ichigo it would likely be in the morning. He hadn't yet started the engines in his mind, the ones that told him what not to reveal to anyone, or rather how to function considering the still blank gaze he was throwing their way. "Not happy to see us, Ichi?" Shunsui asked with a predatory grin, eyes sharp as knives, voice light and teasing. Ichigo shook his head up, then to the side, as if he couldn't decide the correct answer to such a question. Almost unnoticed his hand sneaked out from its place at his side and he grasped the hilt of Zanjutsu, drawing the blade and its presence closer to Ichigo. "Always happy to see you, Captain." Ichigo choked out with a rough dry kind of humored tone. Shunsui raised a hand against his chest in pseudo-hurt, casting affronted looks between Ichigo and Jushiro as if asking his partner if he could believe the snark and sarcasm Ichigo fitted into 6 words. Yukatake only inclined his head to indicate to his partner that he would not aid him in this endeavor. Ichigo sometimes seemed a sprite of snark and sarcasm, and one that would best Jushiro any day in that area. "How do you feel, Ichigo?" Jushiro asked with a light gentle smile, the question in his eyes deep as a whirlpool. Ichigo pursed his lips, and furrowed his brow once more as if trying to piece together an intricate puzzle, and Jushiro reminded himself to never attempt to wake Ichigo up in the morning. He had no idea how Kyan had continued to do so. He had heard horror stories of flailing limbs and nonsense rambling, and survived it. Not when a sleepy Ichigo was apparently an unlocked box of sarcasm and confusion. I'm still a bit tired, but I feel way better than I have in a while. Is there any caffeine, tea?" Yukatake smiled when Ichigo responded with the mostly positive answer, and the predictable seeking of caffeine. Any Shinigami who was employed in a position requiring paperwork, knew the merits and life-saving benefits of the substance whether in coffee or tea. Turning his head, Jushiro traded a minute-happy smile with Shunsui. Returning his gaze to Ichigo, he nodded regarding the orange-haired Shinigami's question about caffeine. It had been asked in such a hopeful voice, eyes bright as the moon, and with Jushiro's confirmation a half-smile settled on Ichigo's lips. Before Jushiro could even heave himself out of the rock-like formation of a chair, Shunsui had pushed him gently back into the seat, wouldn't want him hurting himself on a chair, that was a viable concern with the seats they were seated in, and padded over to a small table resting against a wall. Anohana was a wise and wonderful woman, which Jushiro had seen proven countless times. This was just another case. She had directed them to the room Ichigo was resting, accompanied by a short Shinigami who radiated nerves but had steel in his eyes while was carrying a teapot. Shunsui gracefully poured the liquid into a cup, all the bearing of nobility in their childhood showing through, the long stream of amber surreal in the early morning light. With the tip of his hat in a jovial smirk, he padded over and passed the ceramic mug over to Ichigo. The youth held the cup to his chest for a moment, savoring the warmth, before he took a deep breath of the heady aroma and sipped at the near-scorching liquid. Shunsui settled back into his seat with a huff after placing the teapot back on the side table with a slight clink that was loud as thunder in the silence that lingered about the room. And the fourth. A familiar large hand sought his own out, holding Jushiro's smaller hand in his own warmer palm as they sat there in the silence, content to let Ichigo wake up a bit. It was funny how easy doing nothing got as they grew older. Every once in a while, Shunsui would look over, catch Jushiro staring in a mindless, absent sort of consideration, and smile like the daylight had appeared. It brought a mirroring expression to his own lips as seeing Shunsui's smiles always did. Jushiro briefly looked up at Ichigo after a few minutes of comfortable rest, wondering how the youth was faring having received the promised caffeine, and was surprised by what he found there. Ichigo was holding the ceramic mug, eyes shuttered close, a serene basking expression closing his features. What surprised Jushiro was the light threads of peace that seemed to coalesce around Ichigo. Even from the first day Jushiro had met Ichigo, he had been able to tell within the first few minutes that Ichigo was not all that he appeared or claimed to be. It had been apparent in every motion to their experienced eyes. That in addition to the fact that whatever had happened to Ichigo before he had been inducted by the Shiba clan had been horrible, a war that tells playing in the air around him, and in his gaze. He had carried himself like a warrior, always alert, always tense. And Jushiro knew how that felt from experience, the stress and drain it put on one's self. Then there had been the eyes, they were old, incredibly so for the young soul they hosted. Full of so many emotions always that Jushiro had always struggled to identify what Ichigo was in fact feeling. Sorrow and grief had shown out starkly though. It had been apparent to both Jushiro and Shunsui upon their first meeting that Ichigo was someone to watch out for. Either for the danger he could one day present, the power that hummed in every fiber of his soul, or for the sheer concern that had swelled inside the both of them at the youth's state. It was foreseeable now which choice Ichigo was within their ranks. Oh, he was a man to be feared. Jushiro would never forget the way his blade danced and ripped some strange instinctive style, or the madness in his eyes that sometimes flashed like lightning. But they had also seen a man who sometimes appeared far too innocent for the weight he was carrying, one swamped by a veritable cesspool of emotions and thoughts. There had been pain in every gaze, hurt in every corner of his lips, washed wary only briefly by Kyan's smile or some small quirk, and really it had been the little things in life that made the youth smile, they had noticed. The sunrises, herbal teas, Jushiro and Shunsui smiling at each other like old lovebirds. So, they had without even speaking, which was really not significant considering how often they conveyed words with nothing more than a gesture, agreed to take the youth under the wing. They had realized quite easily and within a brief time that no, Ichigo did not need training, he was highly proficient enough as it was. But they had offered a shoulder to lean on, a cup of tea when the young Shinigami felt he needed it. Ichigo had just clicked with the two of them, in a way that sometimes made Yuka take wonder about the hidden truths in clipped sentences and gestures. Speaking with the two elder captains for hours, about morality, the responsibilities of a governing body in relation to its citizens, the young man could hold a conversation as well as any ancient Shinigami, with intelligent and thought-provoking ideas behind each sentence. Nevertheless, they had slowly chipped away at the diamond-like shell Ichigo surrounded himself with and found the man underneath. Ichigo had been far more than he presented on first glance underneath the shell. Kind, thoughtful, caring, knowledgeable beyond reason sometimes. He was as complex as the rest of them even if it was sheltered and buried underneath the front he presented to the rest of the world to protect himself. It was strange observing Ichigo now, there was something different about him that Jushiro couldn't quite place. It was a good something he could tell that with ease, but whatever it was he had no clue. Only that the weathered shroud of a veteran he had carried around like a cloak wasn't all there, and in its place was Ichigo, maybe not all whole but a different Ichigo nonetheless. As if sensing the rather calculating stare from Yuka-take, the youth looked up and caught Jushiro's eyes, gently lifting his arm with a happy little wave and gesturing the same with the mug. Jushiro copied the movement in a slightly less enthusiastic manner. Shunsui sighed beside Jushiro. It was a fond sound, one that Jushiro liked hearing, as the captain of the 8th caught their little rendezvous with a blatantly fake put-upon frown. Again, Shunsui attempted to strike a dramatic and offended position, tilting wildly in his chair but somehow maintaining balance, and whispered something about his partner and his lieutenant betraying him behind his back. Jushiro set a comforting hand on Shunsui's arm with a knowing and teasing smile, and lightly patted it in what was a sort of sarcastic comforting motion. Low airy laughter drifted from the bed in the center of the room, and the two captains turned their head to find Ichigo sprawled back on the bed, mug carefully placed on a side table, eyes glancing towards the ceiling with a wide-open grin on his lips. He just radiated happiness in a wild, uncaged sort of way that made Jushiro want to hear that laughter many times over. Shunsui's gaze cast back and forth between the bed and his partner, a low pout filling his lips, and he began murmuring about his prized lieutenant and partner once more, though his eyes were flickering lights of amusement. Jushiro let a smile grace his lips, one of the soft real ones, and let it show with a nod towards Ichigo. The youth beamed a bit brighter at the gesture if possible, before he slumped back into the medical gunnery with a soft kind of happy sigh. Ichigo took a steady slow sip from the mug he had retrieved once more, eyes peering at the two captains from over the rim in a slightly humorous manner reminiscent of an owl or a child. Shunsui settled down from his dramatic fit with a curl of his hand running through his locks, sharing a cursory glance towards Jushiro, all the questions and concern in the world there for his partner to see. The white-haired captain nodded minutely, confirming that he was fine and that he thought Ichigo was likely now coherent enough to speak to the two of them, and that perhaps Ichigo was a bit better than even they had been expecting, even with Retsu's warning. If anything was to truly wake up a soul, it would be laughter, that and caffeine. Jushiro amended, gazing at the mug in Ichigo's hands. So Ichigo? Shunsui started before abruptly trailing off as if he was unsure how to continue with his sentence, which was a likely thing. Shunsui liked to present the image that he had everything planned, and knew how to proceed. But Jushiro knew more often than not that was not the case in the slightest. Ichigo cocked his head, eyes a touch wider over the lip of the cup. Shunsui ran a hand through his curly locks again, smoothing them back under the brim of his hat, in a rather difficult motion, before he nodded more to himself and continued, "So you are feeling better?" The reiterated question surprised Yuka-take slightly, having expected a multitude of other questions Shunsui could have thrown to start the conversation instead, ones that reflected more so the worries plaguing the captain of the 8's heart. Ichigo rubbed a hand over his arms again in a tired motion, considering the two elder Shinigami before he replied, "Better's a strange concept when you've been living the same way for a long time. Still, I do feel that way in most senses. I haven't felt this rested in a long time." The orange-haired Shinigami's answer was as upsetting as it usually was, in a way that Ichigo likely didn't even realize. Someone had managed to train the kid to speak partial truths and deflect it with fact, but even then Ichigo wasn't a liar and preferred honesty over it. Ichigo would have made for a scary adversary even without the vast wealth of his powers. "That's good, I'm glad. Lisa's been worried sick." Shunsui echoed in a quiet kind of confirmation that had Ichigo's attention more than the broad heroics. A grimace painted the lieutenant's expression as Shunsui mentioned Lisa. From what Jushiro had observed, the two lieutenants had grown closer over the years working together, and even more so after their extended training period. Shunsui had likened it to the bond siblings often shared, though Jushiro really had no base for it, but he assumed it was a good comparison. They often talked and chatted amicably whenever they worked together, which was often considering their positions, and Shunsui told him they often took lunch together, and as time had passed they had, he supposed, become proficient in working together because of that friendship. Ichigo's head tilted towards the bedsheets in a universal sign of sorrow and apology, hand unconsciously seeking out the hilt of his Zanpakuto and wrapping his fingers around the blade. With a soft frown, he looked up and with his heart behind his words said, "I'm sorry Taiko, I let everyone in the division down, as well as hurt Lisa and you." Shunsui frowned at the response, titling his head forward to shade his eyes and the emotions within them beneath the cowl of his hat. There was silence hovering, the confession lying heavily between the three as Shunsui thought over his answer. Jushiro was a touch surprised that Ichigo had made the first move. He thought it incredibly brave of Ichigo to take the first step forward in responsibility in making an apology. Then again, he had learned long ago that expecting or trying to predict Ichigo was an impossible thing damned to be stopped and refuted at every turn. Jushiro reached out and settled a comforting hand on Shunsui's bicep, warm Reisu pulsing between the two in a familiar nature. In between one breath and the next, Shunsui looked up, staring solely into Ichigo's eyes for a long drawn-out moment before he responded. "Thank you for the apology, Ichigo. I'm glad you understand the necessity of it. It means a lot to me that you took the consideration to apologize." Shunsui struggled with the next part of whatever he wanted to say, fingers idly tracing the floral-patterned haori settled over his shoulders. Jushiro rested a comforting hand over his much larger one, understanding his hesitance. He didn't want to hurt Ichigo, but he couldn't leave his emotions the way they were. Ichigo, I was so worried about you, and after what happened." Shunsui finished, dragging his hand over face even as his sentence trailed off, eyes deep with emotions trying to convey his message. Ichigo frowned softly, his eyes were like gates swung open, emotions blown wide in amber pools in a way that Jushiro had never really seen with the orange-haired Shinigami. I am sorry, Shunsui." Ichigo apologized again, voice low as embers. Shunsui's head snapped up in a rough aborted motion, and likely before Shunsui could even comprehend what he was doing, he was out of the chair and shuffling towards Ichigo. The youth shifted in the bed, eyes wide as Shunsui hovered over him for a few moments, staring at Ichigo as if he would disappear before he leaned forward in a carefully pronounced movement and wrapped his arms around Ichigo. The youth stiffened at the contact, as he seemingly always did, eyes wide as saucers at the gesture and looking a touch misty. Jushiro thought he could catch another mumbled apology under Ichigo's breath as his partner tensed slightly. Shunsui's voice was just loud enough for Jushiro to hear in the emptiness of the room as he spoke to Ichigo. "Enough apologizing, love, all that matters now is that you're safe and home." Ichigo startled slightly at the words, before his hands hesitantly grasping Shunsui's haori tightened to hold the heavy fabric in a white-knuckled grip. Emotions were passing through his eyes like wind, whirling and twisting back and forth in such a cacophony that Jushiro chose to look away from soul-catching ember eyes. Ichigo's mouth hesitantly mumbled over the last word Shunsui had spoken, as if Shunsui had uttered something utterly incredibly to the orange-haired youth. Maybe Shunsui had. It was hard to tell with Ichigo. Some things resonated, the simplest things left him gaping, eyes brimming with emotions, while other words meant nothing even with the philosophy behind them. Ichigo rested his head in the crook of Shunsui's shoulder for a moment, holding on as if letting go he would fall away. Jushiro looked away, giving the two a moment of privacy. He studied the hilt of his Zanpakuto, lovingly running his fingers over the weathered material. After a moment Shunsui pulled back from the embrace, drawing Jushiro's attention. He leaned forward and with all the tenderness of a parent who'll placed a faint kiss on Ichigo's brow, before he treaded back to settle beside Jushiro. Knowing his partner would need it, Jushiro reached out and grasped Shunsui's hand, Reisu warm and assuring between them. Ichigo took a few breaths, regaining his composure, and from the peripheral of his view the white-haired captain could see Ichigo reaching for his blade once more, dependent on his Zanpakuto spirit in a way most Shinigami did. Then again, most Shinigami didn't possess the bond Ichigo did with his spirit. "So, any news from the outside world?" Ichigo asked with a hesitant smile, bringing the room forth from the somber aura it had settled on with the more serious matter of the conversation. Shunsui cocked his head and stroked his goatee, eyes light and mirthful, lips grinning. "Well, we spoke to Anohana." Shunsui teased, leaving the sentence hanging. Ichigo pouted at the blatant teasing, crossing his arms in front of his chest and appearing for the world to see like a child. Shunsui laughed deep and throaty, kindling a light laughter from Jushiro's own lungs at the humorous expression. An unamused expression slipped onto Ichigo's features as he waited for the answer with a huff. Finally, Shunsui relented, recovering his breath. He tipped his hat as if telling a secret and finished, "She said you're free to go home today." A wide grin settled on Ichigo's lips at the news, bright as the sun in the room of the fourth. Jushiro couldn't help the curve of his lips at the contagious expression, sharing a knowing glance with Shunsui even as he settled into the chair with a happy sound. "So, have you been surviving without me, Teiko?" Ichigo asked after a moment, the picture of innocence even if mischief hid under the faux smile. Shunsui huffed and made a few noises of disagreement, eyes darting towards the door as if contemplating escape before he straightened his posture and straightforwardly replied, "Of course, the office was quieter without your presence. Ichigo lasted all of a minute before he was cackling and mumbling about all that Lisa had to endure on her own. Shunsui maintained an affronted look shortly, before his own lips curved into a wide grin and he was joining in on the laughter. Jushiro shook his head in amusement, settling back into the rock-like chair, content to let the two catch up once more. Their home was warm as Ichigo settled in the entryway leaning against a well-placed wall, Kion sliding the shoji door shut behind him with a click. He could almost feel the older brother's concern, alert for the moment Ichigo so much as swayed unsteadily on his feet. And while he liked the warmth welling in his chest at the gesture, there was also a touch of familiar annoyance at the older brother's overprotective nature. Kion popped up beside Ichigo, toeing off his shoes with a light sort of whistle under his breath. He was beyond happy to finally be bringing Ichigo home, and he couldn't blame the clan heir. Still, Ichigo tried to relax the tense cast to his shoulders and focusing on his breathing. He was still far too out of place with his emotions. This was his home, and however much Kukeka would likely act on her new vendetta, mainly Ichigo's carelessness, it was a place where he was safe. He succeeded somewhat in dispersing the tension rolling his shoulders. He didn't understand why it was so hard for him to settle. Perhaps it was anxiety about being home again, and their reactions. Or maybe it was the lingering sense of familiarity that the whole structure carried that was leaving Ichigo out of place. In any case, he acknowledged with a rough kind of sigh that his emotional stability was close to nothing, and he was veritably floating in a sea of emotions. A warm hand settled on his shoulder, jolting him out of drifting thoughts, accompanied by a concerned prod of Reisu. With a curve of his spine he glanced over into Kion's eyes, which were somewhat reassuring, almost stating that the Shiba heir would be behind Ichigo the whole way. It settled Ichigo slightly, just as Zanjitsu's presence swept over him, brushing aside conflicting feelings for a time so he could enjoy being home with his family. Before he could thank Kion for the gesture, and really his brother was being way too caring lately, though Ichigo didn't entirely mind, a blur appeared in the corner of his vision before darting forward and across the entryway. When the blur finally stopped in its abrupt movements, Ichigo identified the new figure as Ganju, standing a few feet away, arms crossed with a pout adorning his features. Ichigo studied his little brother in silence, waiting for the youngest to make the first move, as he had an idea of the reaction he would be presented with. Shibas were as a general rule unpredictable. Ganju appeared much the same as ever, still dressed in variants of earthy green, and the typical Shiba accoutrement of too many bandages. But the kid had sprouted since Ichigo had last seen him, and that was a strangely familiar concept for Ichigo to comprehend. Siblings growing up, and watching them do so, reaching near his chest, maybe his shoulders if Ichigo guessed correctly. There was a kind of pride in the thought that his little brother was growing up, accompanied by a distinct horror and déjà vu that twisted his insides into knots. Zanjitsu carefully picked said knots apart, assuring him in breathy nonsense words that settled the disquiet within his soul. He had become numb to the family dynamic he was a part of, if that was at all possible with the Shiba family, and the ones he had already experienced, and maybe his sudden tip off the deep end with all its negative repercussions had some benefits. Everything suddenly seemed different since he had woken up. Maybe it was brighter in some ways, or maybe he had opened his eyes to whatever he was blind to. But the crux of the matter was, he was seeing his life, the one around him, a touch differently. His family, the relationships he held, his own plans. Ichigo's little brother huffed, appearing moments away from a full-blown tantrum by the somewhat adorable expression on his features, though Ichigo was certain the youth was past that stage. One could never tell with Ganju though. He could be childish one moment, and the next posse's maturity and wisdom like that of Yuka take at other times. That was often how it was in Soul Society. Time was a weird concept, and Ichigo was well experienced with that concept, or as much as any one person could be. Ganju stared at Ichigo. Ichigo stared at Ganju for a quiet few moments, blatant with tension and other less noticeable things, more as they seemed to assess each other. Or rather, Ganju was tracing Ichigo's form as if he could find the cause of Ichigo's illness, or pain, and that sent a bolt of guilt through Ichigo's chest. Because really, he had thought he was done with worrying younger siblings over his well-being, but here he was again, he thought with a slightly aggrieved smile. Ganju's eyes narrowed and his hands settled on his hips, before with the mustering of courage on Ganju's front the youth called out in a tone full of accusation. He said, "Ichigo, you pig." Ichigo blinked a bit in surprise at the words Ganju had spat out with all the petulance and thinly veiled emotions of a young child. Really, Ichigo couldn't expect anything less, but it was still amusing, as was the word choice for such an insult. Smirking, though he let some apology reflect in his eyes, Ichigo retorted sharply, "Is that an insult or a compliment? Considering your love of boars, Ganju." Ganju pouted, a look of consternation dawning his features before his arms were crossed in front of his chest, and he said, "That's not fair, Ichi-nii." Ichigo decided to agree with the sentiment with an appeasing nod. Ganju studied him sceptically for a few minutes, eyeing Ichigo up and weighing his words before he rushed forward and jumped at Ichigo. Said orange-haired Shinigami scrambled to catch the veritable comet hurtling towards him, catching Ganju in open arms and swinging him around a bit, with a considerable amount of effort compared to when Ganju was younger and smaller. The youngest Shiba's arms tightened around his chest like a chokehold, squeezing the breath from his lungs, even as the gesture sent warmth hurtling through his systems and split his lips with a smile. Ganju laughed as Ichigo swung him around a bit, bright and airy, before Ichigo set his brother gently down on the ground with a laugh of his own. Ichigo looked up from where Ganju had returned to studying Ichigo seriously, though there was a brightness to his expression again, one that Ichigo liked to see. Kyan was leaning against one of the far walls, a satisfied and smug smirk on his features. It was soft in all the right ways, and his eyes were like a hearth as Ichigo connected with them. As if hearing the noise and commotion Ganju's hug had caused, Kukeku appeared in the entryway, arms crossed, expression something fierce, and Ichigo and the other males in the room would deny that they had felt fear at such an expression. She came to a standstill in the entryway, eyes wide as saucers as her gaze landed on Ichigo. Had Kyan not told them he was coming home today, the wicked man? Though perhaps he had informed Ganju. Her eyes traced over him almost near frantically, and the expectant and surprised silence from before was back. Ganju quietly and smartly shifted out of the way, and that was all that Kukeku needed to fling herself at Ichigo and wrap her arm around his chest in a suddenly familiar death grip. Ichigo tenderly wrapped his arms around Kukeku, breath leaving his lungs in an awkward gust of air at the force the one arm held. Really, it was just one arm, and it held more of a punch than Ganju's flying tackle. Kukeku pulled back after a moment where Ichigo basked in the comfort radiating throughout his soul. Those pleasant emotions and feelings shriveled up and died at the icy glare that was directed his way. It was as if the vessels in his body had frozen at the look on Kukeku's features. This was why he feared incurring her wrath. And why he knew better than to do actions that would incur it, or at least he thought he knew better. She weakly punched him in the chest with a fond shake of her head and a soft laugh, the glare disappearing as she spoke. "Ichigo Shiba, never do that again." The glare returned in full force and the temperature in the room seemed to drop a few degrees, and she continued, "Because if you do, it will not be pretty, got it?" She ended with a vicious smile that would put even Kenpeki to shame. Ichigo hastily nodded and the room temperature returned to normal, and everyone else in the room let out a quiet sound of relief. A small smile settled on Kukeku's features. There was concern there, but also relief as she reached up to gently caress Ichigo's cheek with sharp eyes. Kyan shifted a touch too audibly in the entryway and she rounded on the clan heir with a fierce frown as Kyan reared back in fright. Ganju sidled over to Ichigo with a laugh, eager to watch a somewhat familiar scene play out. It was almost always Kyan and Ichigo that got chewed out by Kukeku, though when she decided to turn that bite on the elders, that was a sight to see. The Shiba princess didn't even have to say anything before Kyan was apologizing in a hasty mumble, the picture of humility. Kukeku nodded satisfied and stepped back a pace from the rather intimidating pose she had struck the moment she had entered the foyer. As if noticing the sudden and rather large conglomeration of people within the entryway, Kukeku sighed and running a hand through long raven locks turned to Ganju and said, "I now see why you insisted on cooking tonight. Go on, get back to the kitchen, you can glue yourself to Ichi-nii at dinner." Ganju grinned abashedly at her words and the dry tone in Kukeku's voice, before his gaze darted between Ichigo and Kukeku as if he couldn't decide whether he would listen to her words, or whether he wanted to stay with Ichigo more. Giving the youth a gentle shove on the back, Ichigo nodded with a reassuring smile and said, "Go on, I've missed your cooking, and can't wait to taste what you've cooked. We can catch up later." Ganju pouted but nodded and scampered off in the direction of the kitchen with a parting wave and the tread of feet in the distance. As soon as Ganju was out of sight, Kukeku turned her gaze on Ichigo once more, though it started sharp as iron it softened and she pulled Ichigo into a gentle hug this time. "Don't you ever dare worry us like that again, Ichigo, you hear? You need to take better care of yourself. Just remember, we're always here, we're your family. As much as you might wish otherwise, we'll always be here for you." Kukeku admonished, slightly face pressed into the clean and comfortable robes Ichigo was fitted in. Anohana had insisted he could wait to don the familiar and comfortable Shinigami Shiakusho. Her voice was deep with emotions and Ichigo instinctively tightened his arms around her, trying to assure his older sister that he wouldn't be so careless. The moment was abruptly broken as Ichigo's back was seized by tough arms, pulling Kukeku and Ichigo into a tight hug as Kyan cheerfully called out, "Group hug." Ichigo choked on his breath in the middle of the sudden sandwich he was squished into, Kukeku crushed against his chest, or maybe it was more of him being crushed against her, growled out Kyan's name with utter loathing and resignation. The older brother laughed unrepentantly, only squishing his younger siblings tighter against his chest in response. Ichigo reminded himself that leaving Kyan alone, and not giving him attention was never a good thing. He was like a puppy in that respect. If he didn't receive attention he would act, and usually not in the best interests of the people around him. Ichigo squirmed weakly against the iron bear hug he was entrapped in, and mumbled under his breath about dragging Kyan somewhere and seeing how he liked feeling Zanjutsu's blade. The older brother just continued to laugh loud and obnoxiously. It brought a tiny and reluctant smile to Ichigo's own lips. He had missed interacting with his siblings, even Kyan, and his over-exuberance was refreshing compared to the fourth. Kukeku grumbled under her breath before she shifted around and released her one good arm, considering the other was more of a stump than an arm, and proceeded to rack Kyan's arm with her hand. Ichigo could almost feel Kyan pout as he made small hurt noises but refused to let go. Ichigo felt warm squished in between the two older siblings and without thinking much about it slumped in the arms holding him up, and rested his head against Kukeku's shoulder. Instantly the arguing pair were on high alert, concern tangibly rippling through the air, as they quieted gazes darting to their younger brother. Kyan stiffened before he relaxed and Ichigo mimicked the motions before settling once more. Hesitantly Kyan asked, "Ichigo." The orange-haired Shinigami made a vague noise of agreement, followed by another noise of reassurance. Though Ichigo didn't actually bother to lift his head from its resting place on Kukeku's somewhat comfortable shoulder. He could almost feel the older souls trading glances over his head, but really Ichigo was too comfortable to care at the moment. Eventually the two settled and the three siblings just remained locked in a tight embrace for a silent few moments. Kukeku was the first to pull apart from their small huddle as Ganju's voice echoed throughout the Shiba mansion calling on the older sister. Ichigo reluctantly let her go, straightening up in Kyan's arms even as the older brother pulled him tight against Kyan's chest and held him for a few more minutes. Then Kukeku was calling them and Kyan let out a soft kind of sigh and was leading Ichigo further into the warm home, and really it was almost like the Shiba clan radiated warmth, in every breath, gesture, movement. Eventually Kyan pulled Ichigo into the informal dining room, which was a relative mix of comfy seating and a somewhat put-together dining table. The room held a sort of mixed-up feel to it, but in a good way with the wide variety of designs and patterns. The door connecting to the kitchen, at least it did after another door in a hallway, slid open to reveal Kukeku, messy bun, and all. She strode in and before Ichigo could decide on a seat of his own Kukeku was pushing him into a green monstrosity. He sunk into the seat with a bit of surprise and floundering before he finally found himself comfortable. Kyan was watching the scene with clear amusement from where he had settled in an armchair directly to Ichigo's left, and for a second Ichigo wanted to do a double take, because he could really see it. See how the man had become the clan head, all poised looking for all of a minute. Kukeku, satisfied with Ichigo's seating arrangement, settled into the seat on Ichigo's other side with a satisfied grin. Ichigo just sighed in fond amusement at his siblings' antics and shook his head, settling into the seat. A moment later the shoji door slid open and Ganju entered, bouncing with energy. Gray eyes landing on the only orange-haired adult in the room, Ganju popped over to the three of them and settled beside Ichigo on the practically massive couch curling up against his sides. Kyan cooed at the sight, even as Kukeku reached over Ichigo and swatted the eldest Shiba in the room. Kyan frowned, bottom lip trembling before he turned to Ichigo and Ganju and whined about unfair treatment, and cruel younger siblings. Ichigo only laughed in response, far too used to Kyan's antics and the echoing familiarity of antics from his own timeline. Their eldest brother turned desperate eyes towards Ganju, hands spread out before him, and asked out loud, "Will anyone defend my honor? Trampled upon as it is." Kukeku shook her head, and mumbled about older brothers taking care of themselves, which earned a particularly sad puppy look from Kyan. Ichigo just laughed at the question, not acquiescing Kyan with a response. Ganju looked between the three of them before he stood up on the couch and settled his hands on his hips before declaring, "I will defend your honor, brother." With that he proceeded to fall back to the couch. Ichigo was ensconced and before he could move to stop Ganju, lightning-fast hands were roaming over his sides. Ichigo covered his mouth to try and contain the laughter that was bubbling forth without success. Before he could throw Ganju off, Kyan joined in, and Ichigo's clear laughter filled the room as they mercilessly continued to tickle him. Attempting to launch a counter-strike, Ichigo's arms reached out and found Ganju's unprotected sides and began to tickle them. Ganju fell back from Ichigo to escape the torture, bright bubbly laughter drifting from the youth's lips. Kyan grinned, still hovering over Ichigo as he continued to pull laughter from his lips. Fed up with the attack, Ichigo flipped them over with a great deal of effort on the lumpy couch and proceeded to tickle Kyan in revenge. Soon Kyan's own laughter was drifting through the room. It sent happiness thrumming through Ichigo's veins. And really being with his family was the easiest way to find happiness, Ichigo thought with a grin. Ganju laughed quietly, staring for a few minutes, before he called out something about food and was disappearing with the click of a shoji door. Kyan and Ichigo continued to toss and tumble on the couch, trying to tickle each other to death with wide bright grins. Panting underneath Kyan, Ichigo looked up, eyes bright as stars with the joy that just seemed to stretch inside him. A mirroring expression was on Kyan's own features, and Ichigo thought if he could see his family smile like that every day, then everything would turn out okay. Kukeiku coughed loudly in the sudden quiet of the dining room, broken only by their harsh pants and the last traces of laughter. Kyan settled back on Ichigo's thighs with challenge in his eyes, as if daring Ichigo to move him from his perch. Happy to oblige the request, at least it was one in Ichigo's eyes, or maybe a dare. The orange-haired Shinigami bucked his hips, and when Kyan was unsteady, shoved his older brother over the arm of the couch and into Kukeiku's chair. The Shiba princess let out a squawk of surprise, and maybe irritation at the sudden appearance of the puppy in her lap. Leveling Ichigo with a fierce glare even as he settled once more into the large cushion free of the oppressive weight. Kukeiku, as if deciding that standing would be better than sitting with Kyan, which probably wasn't wrong, she heaved herself from the chair. Kyan slumped awkwardly to the side, still a touch dazed or confused at Ichigo's quick actions. A knock sounded lightly on the shoji doors, and Kukeiku swept over to open the doors with an expectant and happy smile. It opened to reveal Ganju, arms loaded with trays of food, still piping hot as the steam drifted in the air above them could attest to. Kukeiku carefully lightened his load and took some trays onto her own arms before ferrying them over to the dining table. Kyan bounced up from where he had been sprawled in the seat he had stolen from Kukeiku, and paced over to Ichigo, offering him a hand. Grasping it, Ichigo was pulled out of the sinking chair to stand on his feet once more, where Kyan guided Ichigo to a place set beside Ganju. Kukeiku and Kyan were seated on the other side of the table, which was the seating arrangement they preferred. At least compared to the other one where Kyan sat at the head of the table, as the clan heir was wont to do according to procedure and tradition, though they really only saved that for formal dining. Ganju darted back into the kitchen with a wink, and returned a moment later with even more trays as he settled them on the table, a feast spread out before them. They thanked Ganju for the meal as everyone settled into their seats and the dishes were passed around and plates were filled. Ichigo's mouth watered at the rich aroma of food that inspired the air and drifted from the food laid out before them. Ganju had really gone all out, again, and really Ichigo needed to praise the kid's culinary skills more, because he was certainly nothing short of amazing. They began to eat, a comfortable and amiable silence between the four diners, even as compliments were delivered to the chef continuously. A blush was already staining Ganju from the tips of his ears to his cheeks. Light chatter started up. Kukeiku, curious about the latest news in Seoul society, spoke to Kyan, even as Ganju turned and began to ramble to Ichigo about what he had done since last the orange-haired Shinigami had seen his younger brother. It must have been a talent of younger siblings to speak for long periods of time without taking a breath, as Ganju continued to talk, occasionally pausing to sample some of his own food, before he delved into a story about the new boar they had found in the outskirts of the 17th district. The meal continued pleasantly warm and homey, in a way that Ichigo missed and loved deeply. It reminded him of the nights in Karakura, Ishine boastful and boisterous as always, Yuzu's delicious cooking, another younger sibling coincidence, Karen talking about her day. It was strange and nostalgic how this life paralleled his old life in so many ways, the people and relationships he held, though he couldn't blame certain people for being exactly how they were in the future, the dynamics he shared in his place within Seoul society. And some things were so different. Because he had been in a war for most of his life once he entered the world of the dead, and that meant that there had never really been this peace and daily monotony as Ichigo had grown up. There had been concern for his well-being, but never in such multitude, and they had never had time to really deal with it and treat it, not when there was another battle taking place. Maybe he missed the relationships he had forged. Who was he kidding? He missed Kami damned everything with all his soul. How easy it was to fall in together and click with everyone in the war. The friends he had grown with, and lived with. The respect he had earned with his prowess upon the field, the characters that were forged in different situations. But he was here now and that meant many things, but Ichigo knew at least a little that he wouldn't trade it if offered, because saving them and their features outweighed his own want of the past. Anohana had said it was okay to want for the past. Had encouraged him to reflect on the happier memories he held of those times, of how his life was now. Perhaps though he shouldn't be doing it at the dining table, as the finger poking his side pointed out. Glancing down at Ganju, who looked a touch put out, Ichigo smiled apologetically and said, "Sorry Ganju, my mind's been a bit spacey lately." Ganju studied Ichigo in that way again, as if he could detect Ichigo's injury through bare sight alone, before he asked, "But you're okay now? You don't have to stay in the fourth anymore." Ichigo's heart stuttered in his chest at the concern in Ganju's voice, and really Ichigo needed to stop worrying his younger siblings, and really siblings in general. He shook his head and with a reassuring smile replied, "I'm okay now Ganju, I just made some foolish mistakes. I'm home to stay though." Ganju nodded, a smile slowly overtaking his lips once more as he turned and shoveled some food into his mouth with a nod. Ichigo grinned and resisted the urge to reach out and ruffle the mop of unruly hair settled on Ganju's head. "How are you feeling Ichigo?" Kukeku asked, voice piercing the lulling cacophony of noise that had settled over the dining table. Turning in his seat to look at his older sister, and Kaien who was eating as if it was the sole thing in the world occupying his attention, Ichigo considered the question, one that had made an appearance earlier in the day. Nodding more to himself, Ichigo replied, "I feel a lot better, and I think I'll continue to get better." Satisfied with the answer, Kukeku nodded and smiled, eyes honest, before she turned to lecture Kaien on his eating habits, which could at times be atrocious. It was a wonder how he managed in formal settings. Ganju turned to Ichigo, eyes bright and expectant, as if ready to account another story or some epic tale, when a loud knock pierces the veil of noise settled over the table. Ichigo cocked an eyebrow, wondering if they were expecting visitors, but as his gaze traveled to Kaien, he could see mirroring confusion on the lieutenant's features, and concluded that this was an unexpected guest. They all sat there for a moment still as stone, almost as if debating answering the door, and Ichigo briefly wondered about the servants, before recalling that Kaien had mentioned giving them the night off. Finally, Ganju jumped to his feet, pushing his chair in and sending a questioning look towards Kukeku, who nodded, curiosity also shining on her features. Ganju beamed and headed towards the door, disappearing from sight as another round of knocks echoed throughout the home. Ichigo wondered who could be visiting them at such an awkward time. It seemed none of the others had any clue as to who their sudden guest could be. The question was soon answered as a familiar loud voice echoed throughout the Shiba household, and the three adults let out simultaneous groans of resignation. While they all loved the clan head, and it was still a strange concept that Ishine was the clan head and managed business, and was serious. At least compared to the father he knew, his presence was overbearing or exuberant on a good day. Still, Ichigo knew they were all secretly a little happy that Ishine was here. The man carried with him a bright sense of life, as if it clung to him. Ichigo also thought his positive attitude was one that was contagious, and being in Ishine's presence while nostalgic and slightly hurting always left Ichigo feeling a touch brighter. Ganju entered the dining room with a skip in his step and a happy grin on his features. Following close behind was Ishine. His heart still jumped every time he saw the man, and Ichigo doubted it would ever stop. But the mind-numbing pain he had first felt upon meeting the man again, had diminished and was more of an occasional dull ache in his soul. Ishine swept into the room, all vibrant dramatic movements. He pulled up a chair to the dining table even as Ganju fetched another plate. Ichigo supposed it was never too late for him to join them for dinner. Ishine froze in his exaggerated movements, as his gaze landed on Ichigo from where he was about to sit down. A relieved look crossed his features, and the thought behind it set Ichigo's chest on fire. Then before he could even think to move out of the way, he was being swept up into another fierce bear hug by the clan head, and really the Shiba clan were tactile people. Ichigo deflated in the tight grasp, tenderly wrapping his arms around the older man and ignoring the familiar smells of his childhood, and the safety of his hind's arms that just seemed to flow through Ichigo. Instead he attempted to focus on Ganju, who was watching the scene with clear amusement and bright eyes, happy to see Ichigo molested. Or rather receive all the positive attention. Eventually Ishin set Ichigo down, the orange-haired Shinigami landing with a huff as he gingerly clambered into his chair once more. Kyan laughed at Ichigo's motions, even as Kukeku flashed a trace of sympathy his way. Ishin stared at the elder Shiba siblings as if contemplating vaulting over the table to give them both hugs. He had already likely given Ganju a hug in the entryway, and Ichigo had no doubt that if he really wanted he would vault the table. Instead the man smiled and settled at the chair placed at the head of the table, loading it with a sample of every dish. Ganju beamed at the action, and Ishin laughed, the atmosphere of the room picking up like sudden spring as Ishin asked Kyan a question. Light chatter sprung up, Ishin guiding the conversation, asking about everyone's day, how their hobbies were progressing. Ichigo was content to sit back and listen to the conversation, occasionally answering whatever question was thrown his way with a soft smile. Just being there at the table with his family was enough to keep a perpetual smile on Ichigo's lips, his chest feeling lighter than it had in a long while. Even with his recent healing there was really nothing that beat a home-cooked meal, and the company of family. Ishin reached over and ruffled Ichigo's hair, a question in his eyes and the curve of his lips, concern there promising a later conversation, and Ichigo couldn't wait for the point where everyone would stop lecturing him on taking care of himself. Ichigo smiled and returned a gentle reassuring curve of his lips as he turned and nodded briefly to Ganju's ramblings. Looking back, he caught a fond satisfied smile on Ishin's features and it made Ichigo's heart ache, but in a good way. Turning his attention back to Ganju, Ichigo listened with a light smile as Ganju described a rather strange patch of moss, happy to let his little brother ramble. He settled into his seat once more, breathing in and out into the moment. He was home, and the future was ahead, but for now there was just his family. X. Chapter 35, Itoin. X. The archives were as dusty as they always seemed to be, years of the stuff piling up like sand on every surface. As Ichigo walked down a clustered aisle that loomed on all sides, filled with parchment and spindly bound books, the oil lamp in his hand swung precariously as he lifted it up to glance at a section, trying to find a text correlating to a certain time period. It cast swaying shadows over the walls in an eerie manner as Ichigo tamped down on the urge to glance around nervously as if the sudden guest in a horror film. His decision to break into the archives in the rather early morning had been a spur-of-the-moment decision. He had been laying in bed, waiting for sleep to come. It hadn't, as much as he knew he needed to sleep, and wanted to, it just eluded his grasp. It would be a few more days before Anohana had the sleeping pills she promised ready, though Ichigo was still skeptical on the concept of the pills actually working. He had tried them once in the middle of the war, a few times in between, when they couldn't afford soldiers who were too sleep-deprived to react. That could cost lives on the battlefield. Instead of the pills allowing him to get a restful sleep, he had been trapped in his nightmares, almost a form of sleep paralysis. Kisuke had been the one to design them, and if that meant anything, it helped to convince Ichigo that the pills wouldn't work. But he would try them because he wanted to get better, and the concept of a good night's rest was still a mostly foreign concept. Sleeping in a coma for 5 days did not count. Almost like a dream in a strange sense of irony. Thinking of Anohana reminded Ichigo that he had an appointment with her in the next week. Really it was Asen reminding Ichigo. He was slightly trepidatious about their therapy sessions. But Ichigo knew if he could trust anyone to provide proper counseling within Soul Society it would be the captain of the 4th. With a sigh Ichigo resumed his earlier train of thought. Sleep hadn't come. He had stared at the ceiling just breathing, listening to Zanjutsu, letting thoughts run in ever-similar circles. Between one moment and the next he had needed an escape, chest tight, soles of his feet itching. An escape from the emptiness of the Shiba home that lingered when everyone else had fallen asleep. So, he had slipped away. After making sure Kyan was asleep, he had had a few incidents where he had been caught in late-night wanderings by the older brother. Ichigo hadn't known his destination at first, just knew that movement, following his feet would help. So, he had walked, traveled along Rungokai's empty streets in the newly chill night air, and just thought. Sometimes it was the easiest thing to do, other times it was near damning, just let idle thoughts drift, contemplate his return to the barracks and Lisa's reaction, what tea house Byakuya and Ichigo should visit. Eventually he had looked up from his musings, at the whisper of Shiro's interest, to see he had stopped in front of a familiar old antiques shop. It was as decrepit as the last time Ichigo had glimpsed it, with its tinted windows and collection of knickknacks clogging the murky glass panes. There was an aura about the place that just warded off strangers, spoke of time and space, the dust of the world. It was an out-of-place shop. Ichigo had stared long and hard at the shop door, rotting wood mottled with green, and his thoughts unconsciously swerved to the tattered old journal tucked away in his room under a floorboard. The book and its contents were still a mystery, one that Ichigo had been attempting to unravel since he had picked the book up again in this timeline. It detailed experiments and events, things that had happened hundreds of years in the past, and things that had only recently come to pass, like an entry about a set of labs being burned down. The dates spread before and after Ichigo had arrived in this timeline. He was near certain that the author was also a time traveler, though there was the possibility of it being someone of an extreme age like the Suteiko. But that wouldn't explain the omniscience in the old and brittle pages. Curiosity piqued, and feeling a refreshed sense of energy to seek the answers, Ichigo had turned towards the archives. The first date written within the text of the bound book, dated well over 500 years before Ichigo had crashed into the current timeline, slipping to the forefront of his mind. If he could find archives or reports from that time, Ichigo considered that he might be able to find a reference of the mysterious time traveler. And that had led him to where he was now crouched in the archives, running his fingers through a stack of aged papers at 3 in the morning. Ichigo had honestly done stranger things before, he thought with an easy humorous kind of smile. Shiro's rough chuckles echoed the sentiment as Ichigo paused and pulled out a thin stack with fading ink. Hefting the oil lamp, Ichigo shined it over the parchment, squinting at the tiny font of dancing characters. It was at times like these that he wished he still had his glasses, if only because it was dark and the font was near impossible to read. He supposed if he visited the world with a Jigai he could get a new prescription. But that would involve visiting the mortal realm, which he wasn't quite certain he was ready for. That was beside the point, he conceded with a nod, as Ichigo settled onto the floor, reliving the strain on his legs that had begun to burn. Maybe he needed to invest in some stretching with his daily exercising. Yuzu had always said yoga was good for healing, right? Zanjitsu's amusement at the sentiment flowed warmly through Ichigo's chest as he placed the oil lamp carefully on the ground, where it would provide a good radius of light. Lifting the paper close to his eyes, Ichigo settled into reading the sprawling text with a purse of his lips and an arched brow. It seemed the author of the stack of paper was a Shinigami from the 10th Division at the same time period of the beginning of the old book. It was a report on a few hollow attacks within the inner districts. It was the typical report format, bland detailing of the hollows encountered, standard injuries, and any casualties. There were some interesting side notes in the margin of the text, mentioning how one of the Shinigami in the squad had disobeyed the captain's orders and gone tromping off in the opposite direction at the sight of the hollow. The Shinigami who had wandered off was listed later in the main report as missing in action. Overall, the report had little information of use to Ichigo, and with a tired sigh he turned and placed it back in the filling system. He resigned himself to a long night of sifting through reports and other documents from the time frame. He was mostly okay with that, or at least he would be if he had any clue of what he was looking for. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Except the needle looked exactly like hay, because as Ichigo could attest to, time travelers didn't really stand out. Well, okay, he did, but that was because of his hair, and his power, so maybe he was a bad example. The most he could hope to find was a mention of a power surge alike to the one Soul Society had experienced when Ichigo had first arrived. Kyan had told him about that night, how the sky had been painted white, the wind had howled and bayed ripping branches from trees. The very air had hummed with power, oppressive. Kyan had described it as eyes shadowed like the depths of the ocean. Otherwise he had no idea what he was looking for. Perhaps a miracle man, or woman really, someone who displayed talents to the masses, that would appear like magic to the general populace or even to the Shinigami. Pausing in his train of thought, Ichigo's brows furrowed as he considered an idea. If the time traveler was from the future and they were a Shinigami, or someone knowing of the Shinigami arts, then figuratively they could have come back and invented them in the first place. His brain was hurting trying to wrap it around the concept, but regardless he pulled out a small notebook he kept in an inner pocket. He had Kukeku sew them on, after one too many complaints about not enough pockets. He quickly jotted down the idea, and a point to research founders of the Shinigami arts. Additionally, he added other things he was looking for in his research. Nodding more to himself, Ichigo could feel Asen's approval at the gesture. Having so many memories got confusing at times, and ideas strayed, and Ichigo thinking quite literally outside of the box, because really anything relating to time travel was outside of the box. Turning around to peruse the stack of sheets once more, Ichigo hummed a song from his teenage years, something punk, with tons of drums, under his breath, as he flicked through a stack, eyes tracing keywords and dates. He would have to come back in daylight and speak to the archivist about the origin of the different Shinigami arts. As he would likely have difficult finding the different sources in the large building, the old man however seemed to know every document within the building. Finding another promising text, Ichigo settled down and cracked open the book, and an actually bound text, though it was quite literally falling apart in his hands, and zoned in on the text. He frowned at some of the words and stuck his tongue out. That was one thing about research into the past. The language was different, words that were used commonly in everyday speech never existed or had completely different meanings in the past. For a large portion of his earlier research, Ichigo had carried around thick volumes of text on language alone. There had also been a few texts on the time period and the culture. It was funny considering Seoul society's rather stagnant state, but a few things had changed. Shaking his head of distracting thoughts, Ichigo refocused on the script, wondering over the pronunciation of a particularly long syllable word. It was a few minutes later that his senses picked up on a new reisu. Ichigo cocked his head, assessing the reisu, ripples of space, the feel of mint and mornings. With a shrug, he returned his attention to the text. He recognized the familiar mirage-like presence, so there was no cause for concern. Ichigo wasn't the only soul who liked to break into the archives after hours. Flipping a page, Ichigo analyzed the text and jotted down page numbers, as well as little facts into the small notebook, and it was a real juggle, that task in between balancing paper and his notes. Ichigo sort of wished he had listened to Kisuke's ramblings about mysteries and deductions, as he sighed and ran a hand through his hair before refocusing on the wavering text. If his escapade served nothing but succeeding in making him fall asleep, he would call the mission a partial success. His thoughts were a soft murmur like music as Ichigo continued to read, settling and shifting against the bookcase every so often to achieve a more comfortable position. Occasionally he would hear the distant whish of fabric, or slide of books, but otherwise the archives echoed with quiet. It was peaceful like the streets of Rungokai, but different, rich with the age and histories of the realm of the dead. Ichigo. The orange-haired Shinigami briefly looked up at the whisper of his name, before he returned his gaze to the text, tracing over a word with a frown, sounding it out, and referring to a collection of translation notes at the back of his notebook. Shiro's amusement rang like a gong in Ichigo's mind, and idly he wondered what the hollow spirit found so amusing, even as he studied the few guidelines, scratched in his own messy handwriting. Ichigo. This time Ichigo ignored the whisper, sure it was just his imagination and maybe his sleep-deprived mind playing tricks on him. Again. It wouldn't surprise him if it was, considering the recent bout of hallucinations he had suffered because of his insomniac tendencies. Asen whispered something about irony in avoiding the subject, but Ichigo only shook his head and turned his attention to a sheet of paper that was far too flimsy. Ichigo. This time the name was said with force and a tug on a strand of Ichigo's hair. Startling slightly, Ichigo blinked owlishly, pulling himself from the pages to look up into Sosuke's deep wine orbs. The man had an exasperated expression placating his features, and in the dim glow of the oil lamp he looked a touch ethereal. The orange-haired Shinigami brightened. Aizen could have chosen to avoid Ichigo, but he had come to visit, or say hi, or chat, whatever the man would prefer to call it. Sosuke would phrase it differently to save his presumed pride, and man did the scientist Ichigo know have tons of pride. The happiness at the thought was accompanied by the familiar and warning knowledge that, of course, Sosuke was not a sociable person. And while he may have sought Ichigo out to discuss whatever findings of his, it was far more likely that the scientist who had refrained from visiting Ichigo in the fourth, it wasn't really his style, Ichigo felt, had finally decided to confront Ichigo. Said Shinigami had all but confirmed for the two scientists that yes, he was from the future. But he had refrained from elaborating more than that, beyond a few brief pointed glares, to illustrate some rules. He was damn near certain that the enigmatic man wanted to grill Ichigo on the future, but perhaps he would wait? Ichigo. His name was followed by another, harsher, tug on his hair. Ichigo smiled apologetically and glanced up once more into Aizen's eyes, filled with a touch of fondness accompanied by sharp annoyance. The older man sighed, one of resignation and long suffering as he dragged a hand over his face. So, what are you doing here, Sosuke? Ichigo asked with a bit of forced cheer in his voice, in between the void of tired and energetic, but barely there enough to muster energy to actually be enthusiastic. The question was also phrased in that inquisitive way, that Ichigo knew would bite at Sosuke's nerves. The scientist in question grimaced at the question, eyes darting to the veritable stack of books collected under his arms. Oh, so he had been here for research materials, and wasn't stalking Ichigo, again. That had been a fun few weeks, where Aizen had been hell-bent on the belief that if he followed Ichigo around he would reveal all of his secrets. Needless to say, Sosuke had received near zero information from his observation, and one ticked orange-haired Shinigami. Researching, what are you doing here, Ichigo? Aren't you still supposed to be in the fourth? Aizen asked with a sharp brow, and a prick of a feral grin. Ichigo blinked a bit in surprise, so Aizen hadn't known he was free from the fourth? That was strange, the man was the kind that wanted or needed to know everything. Still, Ichigo supposed it was rather new news. I broke out of prison, for good this time. Ichigo replied with dry humor, too weary to attempt for sarcastic pep. Sosuke studied Ichigo, really studied him. He could feel those intelligent eyes boring into his skull and everywhere else. Ichigo resisted the urge to fidget to Shiro's amusement, and wondered why everyone was staring him down as if they had X-ray vision. Yes, he had been injured, but Anohana wouldn't have released him if she didn't think he was damn near 100%. Are you sure? I don't think Anohana would want you out here at 3 in the morning. Aizen finally asked after a quiet few moments, where Ichigo was tempted to ignore the scientist and pull out his research again. Though it was a valid question. Ichigo wanted to groan at the question all the same. Anohana had given him the vote of confidence, he was well enough, and in a stable enough sort of mind to be walking around. Just because he wasn't sleeping much, didn't mean there was reason for concern. Ichigo took a deep breath and pushed aside building irritation. They were all just concerned. That had been his mantra through his stay in the fourth, question after question about how he was feeling driving him over the edge. He repeated the same mantra under his breath once more. It had only been one night and already everyone was hovering over his shoulder. Ichigo could readily admit now, that yes, he was fractured, and yes, he had some mental health issues he needed to work through. But that however did not mean he needed a bodyguard for his own safety 24/7. Zanjutsu Asen's presence washed over Ichigo, soothing the irritation with soft whispers, and the lulling feeling of his inner world. Before prodding him to answer Aizen, who was staring at Ichigo with growing concern. Right, not the best plan to complain about being fine and then zone out in the middle of a conversation. I'm fine, her only advice was to avoid a lack of sleeping for a continuous streak. I'll sleep tomorrow. Ichigo answered in a breathy voice, and leaned back against the bookcase, refusing to think about the familiar answer to the question that had hovered on the tip of his tongue. Though Ichigo doubted replying about sleeping when he was dead would not have earned brownie points with Aizen. You never answered my question about what you're doing here, Ichigo. Sosuke finally prodded. There was concern and maybe disappointment on his features, but it was swept away by faint curiosity. Ichigo looked around, arms stretching out as if to indicate the research and ever-growing piles of paper around him before he looked up and responded with an empty, earnest smile, research. For that answer he received a glare that pulled soft laughter from Ichigo's lungs, and he relented after regaining his breath and honestly answered, I couldn't sleep so I decided to do some research. I'm looking for dates correlating to a certain text I've found. Sosuke frowned at the mention of Ichigo's frequent insomnia, before his eyes were lighting up with curiosity, and Ichigo realized he really shouldn't have mentioned the mysterious text, or maybe he should have stopped talking altogether. Because Sosuke's interest was now piqued, and that meant he would not likely be leaving for a while. As if to acquiesce Ichigo's thoughts, the older man settled onto the floor of the archives with a brush of his shiakusho and a huff of breath. Ichigo stared balefully at Sosuke for a few moments, before with a sigh he handed over one of the sheets, letting the lieutenant scan the brittle paper in silence. After a few minutes Aizen looked up, brow furrowed. Ichigo wondered what he was confused about. The report of mysterious sightings around the beginning of the Goti 13, or the language and the use of a verb that currently meant to eat used in a rather dynamic way. I suppose your research has something to do with your time travel. Sosuke fished awkwardly, eyes glancing from the paper to Ichigo. Under the scrutinized gaze Ichigo shrugged his shoulders and flashed the man a wicked grin. An affirmation and a tease, because if Sosuke wanted information he would actually have to ask for it. Ichigo didn't normally go around handing out free information, and especially not to a competent scientist like Sosuke. The key word there was normally. Aizen hummed for a few moments and Ichigo pulled out another stack of paper to study, flicking through it and browsing the opening sentences. It was nice just sitting with Sosuke, not attempting to play around the man's mind games, or refrain from blurting out certain tender information, like the fact that he was a mastermind in a war, or that Ichigo was kind of overpowered. Sosuke coughed after a few minutes, and Ichigo looked up, mostly ready for whatever the man was going to throw his way. Sosuke sized Ichigo up once more, and he was sort of getting tired of that, or maybe he was just cranky, and said, "All right, I'm going to guess a few things." Ichigo nodded and flashed a quick thumbs up. Sosuke nodded, his own lips curving up into a gentle smile that took away the sharpness and revealed the gentle soul underneath. The lieutenant collected his thoughts for a moment more before he continued, "You think there's another time traveler? You have some clue or whatever that indicates this and are searching for proof?" Ichigo nodded and Sosuke continued, "And then there is the fact that you are actually from the future." Ichigo nodded again with a wince at the thought of the future. He was trying to avoid thinking too deeply about the particular subject. At least for a short time, he just wanted to recuperate and recover a bit before he plunged headfirst into time and space. Running a hand through his hair, Ichigo sighed and replied, "A future, the one I came from, can no longer possibly exist in any form." "Oh, and why is that?" Aizen fired back as soon as Ichigo had finished with his confession. The orange-haired Shinigami shifted uncomfortably at the question, pressing back against the shelves behind him that wobbled a bit at the force. Ichigo looked up briefly, before he looked down again. Sosuke could think about it for a few minutes before Ichigo would grace him with an answer. "In your future. I know there was a war, that much is clear. You must have done something to change the course of the future, either through the elimination of an enemy or..." Sosuke spoke under his breath, audible enough for Ichigo to hear his mumblings, as the lieutenant trailed off, eyes going wide with realization. Ichigo flinched sharply, worry beginning to gnaw at his insides. What if Aizen decided that he suddenly did want to wreck Soul Society? What if he was hurt by the news of the future and lashed out? Ichigo breath, deep breaths. "It's okay, Sosuke. As much as he is bitter with some of Soul Society, he has seen what the future you have revealed to him holds. He will just need time to comprehend the revelation." Zanjitsu Asen assured Ichigo, deep rumbling voice soothing Ichigo's nerves and helping Ichigo to calm his breath where it had begun to pick up. Tentatively looking up, Ichigo caught Sosuke staring in concern at Ichigo, the look sent warmth and reassurance running through him twice-fold. He reassured the scientist with a soft smile, and the man nodded briefly before Sosuke's gaze drifted past Ichigo's head to rest on the stacks of paper deep in thought. Picking up a stack of paper, Ichigo turned his attention to the words, content to give Aizen the time he needed to organize his thoughts and comprehend the new information dumped on him. Idly Ichigo wondered what Kisuke and Aizen had been conspiring about after the reveal of Ichigo's true nature. He wondered with a wolfish grin what outlandish theories they had suggested, what they had debated about. What if one of them thought he was Kaien's son? That would have been a strange thing indeed. Ichigo also wondered when one of them would step forward and ask how he had traveled through time. They would probably be a touch disappointed by the answer, if only for the lack of science and machinery. "Ichigo! Ichigo!" The orange-haired Shinigami looked up at the insistent calling of his name to meet Sosuke's bemused glance. Underneath the amusement was a rush of emotions, an uncommon sight for Ichigo to see, though less uncommon now than it had ever been in his own timeline. Sosuke was confused, lost, curious, and a few other things that Ichigo couldn't place, and he felt some guilt for putting his friend in such a place. Though the guilt he felt wasn't enough to push him into spilling his secrets to the man. Aizen had already been inside of Ichigo's head once, and that was more than enough for Ichigo. Sosuke sighed and shook his head before he said, so in your timeline. I gave up on Soul Society and there was a war. But I wasn't the only major player, you considered me a potential ally in the beginning. Even knowing what I could have become. This suggests that while I was a problem, there was a greater enemy who. Sosuke trailed off, eyes dark and empathetic in their sockets. Ichigo's chest was hurting a touch, but Shiro's presence took away the sting and wrapped him up like a blanket. After a second, Ichigo mustered the energy to flash the lost scientist an assuring smile before he continued, there were 2 wars. In the second war, you were an ally in the defeat of the enemy. Sosuke's countenance brightened minutely at the information, and confirmation of his theories. The weight that had settled on his shoulders mainly dispersed lightning fast, however, seeing some tension remaining, Ichigo breathed in and continued, what happened in the future, and the actions of the you of that timeline have no relation to you. The Sosuke Aizen I know. You've already helped me change the future, so don't worry about it, Sosuke. Ichigo finished with a bright smile, trying to convey his feelings on the matter in the gesture. Sosuke looked conflicted for a moment, was likely attempting to process Ichigo's words, before he nodded and returned the smile in a less their way, but meaningful all the same. Unbidden, a large yawn overtook Ichigo and he covered his mouth, tipping to the side to stretch. When he was finished, he looked up and caught Sosuke's keen gaze. He had all of a minute to regret the action before the older man was advising, you should probably go home, Ichigo, and get some rest. You can speak to Kisuke and I later, when you have the actual energy and coherency for it. Ichigo swatted lightly at Sosuke's shoulder at the snark in his words, but nonetheless tucked his notes into his pockets and shuffled the loose paper back into the binders. With another quick yawn, Ichigo unsteadily rose to his feet, swaying a bit on the way up before regaining his equilibrium. Sosuke watched the scene with concern mixing with amusement even as he rose to his own feet, gaze darting to one of the few windows in the archive, letting faint rays of light peek through like dust. It was probably early morning already, and Kaien would surely yell at Ichigo for his careless interactions. Ichigo couldn't much find it in himself to care. They walked to one of the less-known entryways together in silence, comfortable and filled with thought. Arriving at the door, Ichigo's arm was caught by Sosuke's hand as he turned to open the door. Looking into the scientist's eyes, he could see the unspoken relief that Ichigo was okay, and that he had forgiven him. Night, or rather morning, Sosuke. Ichigo said with an easy smile and a tip of head. Sosuke smiled in return, eyes illuminating at the words before he let go with a nod, and Ichigo nodded back once. Before he darted out the door and through Rungokai's early morning streets, just beginning to bustle with life. It had been a good night, lack of sleep ignored. Ichigo felt content with what had occurred, it made his soul feel light. As he traveled home with a faint smile on his lips, Ichigo braced himself for Kaien's diatribe, knowing it was fueled by love. Then he could finally try and get some sleep. It was sometime in the late afternoon when a knock rang throughout the house. Ichigo shuffled in bed, blearily opened an eye before he rolled back over, and tucked himself into the covers with a groan. For a moment, there was sweet blissful silence, and Ichigo started drifting again, warm soft bed, exhaustion pulling him under. The knocking resumed with increased noise, and while Ichigo was tempted to pull his pillow over his head, instead he sent a half-hearted glare at his bedroom door and prayed that someone would actually answer the damn thing. With that thought, Ichigo pulled his blankets over his head and attempted to rejoin Morpheus' realm. It lasted for all of a minute before the knocking began again, except this time it went for a minute straight. As Ichigo was trying to comprehend why someone so desperately wanted a member of the Shiba household to answer the door, he threw back the blankets and roughly pushed himself up to a seating position. Tired of listening to the knocking and hesitantly deciding to resolve the station himself. As he was objectively staring at the door to his room like it was a familiar face, he recalled that Kukeku and Ganju had vacated the house some time ago, and really it was more of a vague recollection of Kukeku's voice piercing his sleep, followed by the slamming of a door. With another particularly venomous glare as the knocking resumed, Ichigo settled his feet on the floor, hissed at the cold, and padded towards the door, swaying on his feet. He yawned, still tired from earlier in the day. It had been his idea to spar with Zanjutsu, because while he wasn't permitted to go back to active duty yet, he still needed to keep in shape. Kaien, the ever-overprotective older brother, had instantly vouched to watch over Ichigo, in case he pushed himself too far, and he had of course admitted to what Ichigo had suspected in the first place. He just wanted to see Ichigo's true power, and awesome dueling. It had been a grueling spar, but in the good way, testing the limits of his body in the way only a few people could, pushing him into working up a sweat. His muscles twanged thinking of the various maneuvers he had pulled off to avoid Zanjitsu Asen's fluid strokes and graceful steps. Not to mention the brute force behind each of Shiro's strikes, accompanied by wild instinct. He hadn't realized he was so tired till after the spar, when basic cognitive functions had dimmed to something painfully slow. Kyan had given Ichigo a particularly unimpressed look, one filled with a mix of fondness and resignation as he ushered Ichigo to his room. He had rolled Ichigo under the covers, whispered something about getting a nap, kissed his brow, and then had disappeared to do whatever official clan business the older brother was wont to do. Ichigo had drifted off damn near instantly. And maybe it hadn't just been the training that had him tired from head to toe, he was getting sleep, but Anohana had just delivered the pills early in the morning, far too early for Ichigo's liking. Without them he had still been struggling to get a full night's rest, still he was doing better, it was just going to be a gradual process. He had accepted that after Asen had drilled it into his head too many times to count. Looking up from where his feet had unconsciously been guiding him, Ichigo stared in trepidation at the door. Before with a sigh he mustered all the bitterness at being pulled from his bed and opened the door. He blinked in mute surprise at the familiar purple-haired Shinigami on the other side of the door, fist poised for another knock, and had she really been standing here for 5 minutes waiting for someone? The Shihoan princess blinked for a moment in surprise, staring at Ichigo and obviously noticing his rather ruffled state, before a small smirk tilted her lips and Ichigo resisted the urge to run his hand through his hair. Instead he sighed and mustered a rough, "What?" Yuriuki pouted at the, somewhat, rude answer, but Ichigo couldn't muster the energy to care. He would apologize later, maybe procure some catnip and set Yuriuki off on her lieutenant, see how Swafon liked that. Now Ichigo, is that any way to greet an old friend? Yuriuki asked with a grin, the area near her seeming to brighten infinitesimally at the gesture. Right, how could Ichigo have forgotten that Yuriuki was the damn near personification of the sun, wonderful from a distance, something else up close. Ichigo didn't resist the urge this time and ran a hand through his hair, throwing Yuriuki a dry look in return to the teasing question the captain had posed, before he looked back briefly at the house. He was going to tell Yuriuki something that would helpfully steer her away so he could get back to sleep. Ichigo twitched slightly as he remembered and turned to face the Shihoan princess before he informed her of the unfortunate news. Kukeiko's not here, her and Ganja went out. Ichigo finished with a shrug. He was mostly certain that they were likely in Rungokai, probably distributing food to the residents of a poorer district. Things had been getting better in Rungokai, the poorer districts seeing some change, especially with the addition of the militia. But the recent surplus of souls, plus the traditionalism of soul society, meant that there would always be those hungering. Then again Ichigo reflected faintly, that it was the same in any society. When he looked up again, he expected to see mild disappointment on Yuriuki's features. Instead a cat-like grin painted her features, and she was positively glowing. Ichigo could already tell that it was going to be a long night, whatever she was recruiting him for. Now Ichigo, can't I hang out with my favorite orangette? Yuriuki said with a pout and then switched to a wink and a grin. Ichigo refused to let his irritation show, instead he took a deep breath and remembered that no, cat did not always taste as good as it was said to, no matter what Shiro insisted. And that additionally Yuriuki wasn't always this annoying, he was just grumpy because had been woken up, which was veritably her fault. He wasn't going to say anything about the nickname relating to his hair either. He had heard them all before by now, though Shinji had managed a new one to surprise Ichigo when they were training, though it was less of a nickname and more of a curse, and Yuriuki using it meant nothing but a dull amusement to Ichigo. There was bit of fondness associated with the term, if only for the warmth in Yuriuki's eyes when she looked at him. And that she had avoided using Mashiro's nickname for Ichigo was another boon. Rolling his eyes, Ichigo briefly turned his gaze behind him, glancing at the entryway, before asking, "What do you want, Yuriuki?" He managed to say it without sounding like he was choking on leather, which Ichigo counted a success as he decided to lean on the doorway rather than support his own weight. Yuriuki laughed at the question, leaning forward into Ichigo's personal space to study him like a specimen under the microscope before she pulled back and said in sing-song tones, "Well, someone is cranky." "Did I wake you, Ichigo?" Ichigo stared for a moment, dubiously, before he nodded, a small pout squeezing its way onto his own lips at the prolonged conversation, and evading of the answer Yoriyuki was managing. As if taking pity on the tired soul in front of her, Yoriyuki twirled her plum hair between her fingers, it was long now, near what she sported in his own timeline, and said, "Well, you see. Shinji decided that he wanted to preserve unity between the Vizard, in case anything goes awry. You know, safety and all that. So, he decided that we should have dinners semi-regularly. And well, you see, Ishine overheard, and declared that we should have lieutenant and captain dinners, and well." Yoriyuki drifted off with an easy smile, all grinning teeth and apology. Ichigo decided to breathe through his nose, and search out Zanjitsu's presence as he computed the information. It had probably been Hiyori who had leaked it, no doubt unintentionally. The woman was just too loud, especially when Shinji was added to the equation. Still, Yoriyuki was avoiding the point of her visit, and with an impatient gesture he made for her to continue, trying to keep his expression open, and away from looking like he was a minute from exploding. Yoriyuki considered Ichigo for a moment before she smiled reassuringly and continued, "So we're having dinner in say half an hour. Sort of short notice and all that. With all of the captains and lieutenants, and afterwards we, the Vizard, are going to go out for drinks. Hopefully next time everyone won't insist on barging in." Ichigo held tightly onto Zanjitsu's presence, letting the older spirit's soothing presence wash over him as he comprehended the subtext in the Shihoan princess message. What she was telling him was she was basically the messenger, and that he needed to get ready for dinner with all the big personalities of the Godi 13. Great. Really, Ichigo did not want to socialize, or attend the dinner. He had originally planned to spend the evening finishing some research. He was almost thinking of getting some string and a board to try and make some connections, and then maybe work on a technique he was adapting. Those plans were firmly trashed now, might as well have fed them to the Danga cleaner. Shiro cackled in the back of Ichigo's mind. He had half a mind himself to just shut the door and barricade himself in his room. Or he could let Shiro out to play with the Godi 13, that was a bad idea though. If Ichigo was anything of his generation, it was partially antisocial, okay, mostly antisocial, and not a fan of events involving people. Looking up from where his thoughts had been drifting once more, he caught sight of Yoriyuki planted their hands on her hips, face jutting inches from Ichigo's own. He leaned back a bit and with a breath out of disappointment and a drop of his shoulders he replied, "Fine, I'll be there. Can I go and be in peace now?" Yoriyuki blinked owlishly at his response, before she laughed a bit, and then that turned into more of a cackle. Dread filled his stomach, and Ichigo could almost imagine ears twitching with mirth atop her head, and really imagining her with cat additions was not a far stretch, considering how everything about her reminded him of cats. "Sorry Ichi, no can do. Shinji and Kaien assigned me to stick with you till it's time. They want to make sure you don't get lost on the way, or as Kaien said, so that he doesn't fall asleep again." Yoriyuki said with an honest tilt to her head even underneath the teasing voice. Ichigo groaned and dragged a hand over his face, but stepped back to let the captain of the second inside. Of course, his brother would team up with Shinji. The mere thought sent chills down Ichigo's spine just thinking of it, because those two, who were overprotective as all hell, put together only spelled disaster for Ichigo. Not to mention future plotting, that Ichigo had no doubt was already being implemented. Yoriyuki glided in as Ichigo slid the door open with a pained smile. He led her to the living room, asked her about a drink. Kukeiku had spent days drilling manners, the proper ones or something, into his head, and then once she was settled pivoted towards the stairs. Maybe if he was lucky he could sleep till they needed to go, and hope his hair looked presentable. But no, Ichigo groaned out loud in annoyance as Yoriyuki's footsteps behind him made themselves known, and he had probably surprised her again. Knowing there was no way he was going to ditch his trusty tail, Ichigo paced to his room, flipped around to see a bemused smirk on Yoriyuki's face and entered his room with a melodramatic groan. Ichigo could already tell this was going to be a long night. The location Shinji had picked for their dinner was phenomenal, or at least it would have been if they weren't trying to cram 27 people into a restaurant not suited to that size. Still, Ichigo supposed it could have been worse from where Shinji was plastered on his left, and Shunsui on his right. At least someone had had the bright idea to create a seating plan of some kind, because the current captain of the 11th, he had funny facial hair was all that Ichigo remembered of the man, was an explosive man, though he didn't see him anywhere in the crowds. And well, certain personalities did not get together so well. It helped that he was at least squished between two people he knew very well. He could very well have been placed beside Kojiro, the head captain's lieutenant, who Ichigo had spoken to only briefly, and that had been about teas and different blends. Or worse, Anohana, who would have likely spent the whole dinner lecturing Ichigo on his health. Ichigo glanced around the multiple tables pushed together, a sea of mostly familiar faces with a few lost to time or memory. Ichigo had noticed near as soon as entered the room hot as a sauna, that the Suteiko had somehow escaped on the dinner. Ichigo wished he could have been as lucky to escape the circus of a night. Alas, he was not an ancient elder who could probably get away with whatever he wanted. An elbow seated itself in his side, and Ichigo jolted, casting a suspicious gaze at the grinning blonde next to him. Shinji had been waiting outside the venue for Ichigo, or at least it seemed that way. Perhaps he had been waiting for other guests as well. He had stared at Ichigo for a quiet few moments as if divining the truth in the light purple under his eyes, and the mess for hair he sprouted. Then Shinji had shared a grin with Yoriyuki, that just screamed about how the two were lovers of cats, and damn near personified the animals. Shinji had wrapped an arm around Ichigo's shoulders, gentle and light eyes asking if it was okay, and escorted Ichigo inside ignorant to Ichigo's depressed mumbles. The building did have a nice interior, all polished wood and the scent of tobacco. But the overcrowded atmosphere seemed to exhume every living thread of the rooms. Shinji winked, raising a finger to his lips for the universal gesture of silence before he directed his finger to the next table over, where Ishine was making a scene, as to be expected, and Rangika was flirting with one of the waiters. His heart ached a bit at the sight of the young lieutenant. Recalling the wonderful woman she had grown into, always caring for others, and always one to have fun. Her presence reminded Ichigo of Jin, the young snake, and he made a mental note to ask Sosuke on how the young protege was, because Ichigo was not going to stop by Shinji's office, the hellscape it was, long enough to find out. A few waiters returned, juggling glasses in every nook and cranny of their arms, interrupting whatever Shinji was about to say as they whirled around and set the drinks down. Ichigo breathed out a deep sigh at the rich green tea he had selected, the aroma of the blend helping to soothe his nerves. Across the table, Rose caught Ichigo's eye and waved cheerfully. Ichigo mirrored the gesture before returning his gaze to the deep liquid. "So Ichi, I've been hearing you're the one who put the idea about the mortal realm into Kisuke's head." Shinji drawled, eyes mirthful as he turned his head and nodded at something Lisa had shouted from across the table. Ichigo wondered if they served alcohol at the restaurant. In conjunction with that thought, was the image of Soul Society burning down in flames. A collection of drunk powerful people was never a good idea, and Ichigo only prayed everyone was wise enough not to drown themselves in sake. Turning his attention back to Shinji's question, he nodded with a happy little self-satisfied smile. Kisuke deserved to see the human world and all of its inventions. If it helped Soul Society develop and grow, that was only a bonus. Shinji nodded and seemed to mull over a question as he sipped at his own drink, which looked to be sake, but could have been tea. "Ichigo!" A voice called out, and Ichigo turned his head to identify the speaker, eyes landing on Love suddenly seated beside Rose. He envied the man's late appearance, the less time he had to spend in the crammed room the better. Ichigo waved a bit at the duo again. Rose and Love shared a look. The kind that only partners managed to share, where they were speaking without words. Jushiro and Shunsui were masters in that form of communications. Ichigo had once watched a full-blown conversation, communicated only in eye twitches, and the curve of their lips. "Are you planning to take the open captain's position, Ichigo? You'd be perfect for the position." Love asked, deep voice piercing the cacophony of noise. Ichigo stared at the man, brow furrowed in confusion, lips tilted in a half-frown. He questioned, "The open captain position?" Shinji turned in his seat to peer at Ichigo before he asked, "You haven't heard?" Ichigo shook his head at the question, and resisted the urge to snap back that Kaien had refused to divulge any gossip during his stay in the fourth. And that Ichigo was still trying to figure out what had happened since his stay in the blasted division. Still, an open position within the ranks of the Godi 13 was a pretty major thing, and something he would have expected to hear about. Well, you know how there's been debates over creating another division because of the awesome powers of the Godi 13. Ichigo nodded, his head attention focused on the information Shinji was delivering. The blonde continued, well, the idea was scrapped, because why spread our forces when we can consolidate our strength or some shite like that? Well, we all were told that about a week ago at a captain's meeting. Thing is, captain of the 11th didn't show up. We searched for him, ya know. Big hustle, surprised you haven't heard. Ichigo frowned at the information, warning bells ringing throughout his mind as he thought of his own timeline, because a captain doesn't just go missing and it doesn't get talked about. Though Ichigo supposed with the Vizard situation in his own time, a missing captain may not have spelled the same surprise it did now. I wonder. Ichigo growled out, sending a glare at Kyan, who was animatedly gesturing to Mashiro, hands weaving some grand story. His older brother froze, shivers tracing his spine, and Ichigo considered his task done before he turned his attention back to Shinji, prompting the blonde to continue. It was Rose who continued. Apparently there was no trace of him anywhere, no note, sign, anything. Some reported him doing a solo recon mission in one of the outer districts, but it wasn't official in the records. We're still searching, but Yamamoto is starting to accept referrals and organize the battle challenges from the 11th, if only because there's nothing to do about it. Wasn't Ajiro really adept at Reisu sensing? Maybe he thought he felt something. Shunsui butted in from Ichigo's other side, eyes keen with interest. Ichigo felt his head spin a bit, but he took a breath, pushed the tidal wave of emotions down, and let Zanjitsu soothe him. It was a bare possibility, but Ichigo wondered if the eccentric man had found some trace of the Quincy. So, are you going to apply, Ichi? Shinji asked, reiterating the earlier question. Ichigo thought about it for a moment, considered what it would be like to be captain of a division. He had lead in the war, but that was different from the daily monotony of being a captain. He just couldn't see himself doing it. He barely survived the office work of being a lieutenant as it was. Only Shunsui managed to save him in that respect. The notion was quite frankly amusing. He could almost picture the comical image in his mind, and his mirth betrayed him as laughter left his lips. He received a few concerned looks for the gesture, but Ichigo placated them with a smile once he had settled and responded, "No way, I barely survive being a lieutenant as it is. I just can't see myself as a captain." The orange-haired Shinigami received dubious looks for that answer, and Ichigo swore he saw a few conspiring looks thrown across the table, but the matter was dropped. Ichigo settled into the seat as the food was delivered in waves, a general variety of food to feed a crowd, good and heartwarming if the smell was anything to go by. Light chatter drifted between the occupants of the restaurant, and Ichigo observed it with a warm, subtle smile. Byakuya waved at Ichigo from where he was squished beside Jinrei, and Ichigo flashed the man a sympathetic smile before his attention drifted off again. The atmosphere of their gathering reminded him of the earlier days in the wars, when a battle was celebrated with dinner. The atmosphere was gritty, but there had still been light. He doubted before the war that the top hierarchy of the Godai 13 had ever assembled in such a manner. Especially not after the dismissal of so many of their powerful members. War was like that, brought people together. Sure, it was usually in the wrong way, but the bonds of war were stronger than time itself, Ichigo reflected with a self-depreciating smile. A fist lightly tapped against Ichigo's forehead and he turned his attention to Shinji, who was beaming at Ichigo like the sun. In some respects, Ichigo considered Shinji to be like a sibling, a brother even. They had light fights, arguments for fun, they both annoyed the hell out of each other. It was a nice dynamic for Ichigo to have, even if he did sometimes want to bash the blonde's head in sometimes. "Say, Ichi, what was it like while you were having the long nap?" Shinji asked, drawing the attention of near half the attention of the table. Ichigo flashed the man a glare, for which he only received an unapologetic grin in return. Ichigo ran a hand through his hair and wondered how to formulate a response. He couldn't really say he had met children of the future who he knew from the past. It was kind of like floating, you know. Time wasn't really a thing, but it was warm in an abstract sense. Ichigo answered with a shrug. He could just feel Anohana's inquisitive stare from across the table, and knew in their therapy session in the next week, she would be grilling him on what he actually saw. The others just grinned, mumbled something about Ichigo getting a lot of sleep, but he ignored it. The captain of the 5th was grinning again, and Ichigo knew that never boded well for the party involved. Though it seemed the blonde was temporarily done with his interrogation session, though Ichigo didn't doubt that it would likely resume at the bar. Before Shinji could continue whatever he was plotting, Hiyori had yelled something across the table that ignited Shinji's nerves. In an instant, the two were bickering across the table, trading gruesome faces and insults, regardless of the other patrons in the restaurant. Ichigo shared a look with Sosuke, who had mustered one of long suffering, and burst into quiet happy laughter, Rose's musical voice, and Love's deep baritone joining in. The light atmosphere remained as happy conversation flowed, and good food filled their souls. Ichigo smiled and settled into the warmth of his chest, and the night, he was still tired, but being here was at least somewhat worth it in the end. Check the description for the links to the author.